My own son handed me a single black trash bag containing my clothes and told me I no longer fit the aesthetic of my own home. His wife stood on the porch of the multi-million-dollar Atlanta estate I paid for, complaining about the ghetto clutter she had just tossed into an industrial dumpster. That clutter was my late wife Vivian's entire legacy. They pointed me to a run-down state facility and told me to disappear. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply turned around and walked away. But what those two fools did not realize was that a retired structural engineer knows exactly which load-bearing walls to knock out to make a house collapse. Before I tell you how I tore their perfect lives down to the foundation, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your parents should always come with a devastating price. My name is Clifford Henderson and I am 74 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer, building commercial high-rises across the country, while quietly investing every spare dollar into real estate. Vivian and I built a quiet, beautiful life together. We did not flaunt our wealth. We wore simple clothes, drove reliable cars, and poured our love into our only son, Julian. When Vivian passed away suddenly last year, my world went completely dark. The quiet of our massive, historic brick estate in Buckhead, Atlanta became suffocating. So when Julian asked to move in temporarily with his new wife, Chloe, I made the biggest mistake a grieving father could make. I said yes. I thought having family close would heal the void in my chest. I thought Julian, who was struggling to get his tech startup off the ground, needed his father. I was wrong. They did not want a father. They wanted a free luxury hotel and an ATM. The true nightmare began on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. I was returning home from a routine checkup with my cardiologist. The car pulled up to my long circular driveway and my heart instantly dropped into my stomach. Sitting right on the curb, crushing the manicured grass Vivian used to meticulously care for, was a massive rusted industrial dumpster. I stepped out of the car, my knees feeling heavy. I walked toward the steel bin and looked over the edge. What I saw inside made my breath catch in my throat. It was not old furniture or construction debris. It was Vivian. There, buried under discarded cardboard boxes and empty iced coffee cups, was her vintage Singer sewing machine, the one she used to mend Julian's torn jeans when he was a little boy. Next to it were her favorite floral dresses, the ones that still faintly smelled of her signature lavender perfume. And scattered across the top like meaningless trash were our family photo albums. Decades of memories, vacations, birthdays, anniversaries just tossed away like garbage. I reached in with trembling hands and pulled out one of the heavy leather-bound albums, brushing the dirt off the cover. My chest tightened with an agonizing grief that quickly morphed into something entirely different. A cold, hard rage began to freeze the blood in my veins. I turned toward the house. Standing on the expansive wraparound porch were Julian and Chloe. Chloe was wearing expensive designer athletic wear, holding a green matcha latte, looking at her phone. Julian stood beside her, wearing a crisp, tailored suit, looking every bit the successful tech CEO he pretended to be. I walked up the stone steps, my face a blank mask. "What is the meaning of this, Julian?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Chloe rolled her eyes and took a sip of her drink before Julian could even speak. "Oh my God. Clifford, please do not make a scene." She sighed in that condescending, high-pitched tone she always used with me. "We are remodeling the entire ground floor. This house is a historic gem, but the interior was completely ruining our vibe. We had to purge all that old ghetto clutter. It was frankly embarrassing to have our investors over with all those dusty doilies and ancient junk everywhere." Ghetto clutter. She was referring to African artifacts Vivian and I had imported from Ghana. She was referring to hand-carved mahogany tables and family heirlooms that told the story of our ancestry. I looked at my son, expecting him to defend his mother's memory. Instead, Julian just adjusted his expensive watch and looked me dead in the eye with a chilling corporate coldness. "Chloe is right, Dad," Julian said without a trace of emotion. "We are hosting a massive launch party for my startup next month. We need the space to reflect success and innovation. You living here shuffling around looking sad all the time, it just does not fit the aesthetic we are going for anymore. You are holding us back, holding them back. I paid the property taxes. I paid the utility bills. I had even paid off Julian's massive credit card debts twice in the last 5 years." Julian reached behind the porch pillar and pulled out a single black plastic trash bag. He dropped it at my feet. It landed with a pathetic thud. "I packed your essentials," he said, handing me a folded piece of paper. "This is the address to the Pine Haven Care Facility. It is a state-run home, but it is perfectly adequate for your needs. I already paid for the first month. The car I called for you should be here any minute. You need to be around people your own age, Dad. You need medical supervision." Medical supervision. My mind raced. I was 74, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. My doctor had just told me I had the heart of a 50-year-old man. They were not sending me away for my health. They were discarding me because I was an inconvenience to their high society masquerade. A normal man would have screamed. A normal father would have slapped his son across the face, demanded respect, and ordered them off his property. But I am not a normal man. I spent my entire career calculating stress points, figuring out exactly how much weight a structure can take before it collapses. I looked at Julian and Chloe standing there on my porch, dripping with unearned arrogance, and I realized something vital. If I fought them now, they would just call the police, claim I was having a senile episode, and make my life miserable. If I kicked them out today, they would just move to another apartment and continue their pathetic facade of a life. That was not enough. They had thrown my wife's soul into a dumpster. They needed to lose everything. I looked at Julian's smug face and then at Chloe, who was already scrolling through her phone again, completely unbothered by the fact that she was tearing a family apart. I did not say a single word. I did not shed a single tear. I bent down slowly, ignoring the ache in my knees, and picked up the black trash bag containing a few of my shirts and pants. I clutched Vivian's photo album tightly under my left arm. I turned my back on my own son and walked down the long driveway toward the waiting car. I could feel their eyes on my back, likely celebrating their easy victory. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was too weak, too broken by grief to fight back. As I got into the back seat of the car, I looked out the window at the beautiful brick estate I had purchased decades ago. I watched Julian put his arm around Chloe, laughing about something as they walked back inside my house. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the dumpster and my past behind. As we drove down the tree-lined street, I opened the banking app on my phone. It was the account I used to manage the household expenses, the one Julian had joint access to for absolute emergencies. The screen loaded. My balance, which should have shown over $40,000 to cover the upcoming property taxes and maintenance, read exactly $12.50. I stared at the numbers. They had not just thrown me out. They had completely drained my liquid cash. A message popped up on my screen. It was from Chloe. It read, "We used the funds for the demolition crew. Consider it back rent for living with us all these years. Have a nice life, Clifford." I took a deep breath, letting the cold logic of an engineer take over my grieving heart. The demolition had been scheduled. Now it was time to light the fuse. My own son handed me a single black trash bag containing my clothes and told me I no longer fit the aesthetic of my own home. His wife stood on the porch of the multi-million-dollar Atlanta estate I paid for, complaining about the ghetto clutter she had just tossed into an industrial dumpster. That clutter was my late wife Vivian's entire legacy. They pointed me to a rundown state facility and told me to disappear. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply turned around and walked away. But what those two fools did not realize was that a retired structural engineer knows exactly which load-bearing walls to knock out to make a house collapse. Before I tell you how I tore their perfect lives down to the foundation, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your parents should always come with a devastating price. My name is Clifford Henderson, and I am 74 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer building commercial high-rises across the country while quietly investing every spare dollar into real estate. Vivian and I built a quiet, beautiful life together. We did not flaunt our wealth. We wore simple clothes, drove reliable cars, and poured our love into our only son, Julian. When Vivian passed away suddenly last year, my world went completely dark. The quiet of our massive historic brick estate in Buckhead, Atlanta became suffocating. So when Julian asked to move in temporarily with his new wife, Chloe, I made the biggest mistake a grieving father could make. I said yes. I thought having family close would heal the void in my chest. I thought Julian, who was struggling to get his tech startup off the ground, needed his father. I was wrong. They did not want a father. They wanted a free luxury hotel and an ATM. The true nightmare began on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. I was returning home from a routine checkup with my cardiologist. The car pulled up to my long circular driveway and my heart instantly dropped into my stomach. Sitting right on the curb, crushing the manicured grass Vivian used to meticulously care for, was a massive rusted industrial dumpster. I stepped out of the car, my knees feeling heavy. I walked toward the steel bin and looked over the edge. What I saw inside made my breath catch in my throat. It was not old furniture or construction debris, it was Vivian. There, buried under discarded cardboard boxes and empty iced coffee cups, was her vintage Singer sewing machine, the one she used to mend Julian's torn jeans when he was a little boy. Next to it were her favorite floral dresses, the ones that still faintly smelled of her signature lavender perfume. And scattered across the top like meaningless trash were our family photo albums. Decades of memories, vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, just tossed away like garbage. I reached in with trembling hands and pulled out one of the heavy, leather-bound albums, brushing the dirt off the cover. My chest tightened with an agonizing grief that quickly morphed into something entirely different. A cold, hard rage began to freeze the blood in my veins. I turned toward the house. Standing on the expansive wraparound porch were Julian and Chloe. Chloe was wearing expensive designer athletic wear, holding a green matcha latte, looking at her phone. Julian stood beside her, wearing a crisp, tailored suit, looking every bit the successful tech CEO he pretended to be. I walked up the stone steps, my face a blank mask. "What is the meaning of this, Julian?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Chloe rolled her eyes and took a sip of her drink before Julian could even speak. "Oh my God, Clifford, please do not make a scene." She sighed in that condescending, high-pitched tone she always used with me. "We are remodeling the entire ground floor. This house is a historic gem, but the interior was completely ruining our vibe. We had to purge all that old ghetto clutter. It was frankly embarrassing to have our investors over with all those dusty doilies and ancient junk everywhere." Ghetto clutter. She was referring to African artifacts Vivian and I had imported from Ghana. She was referring to hand-carved mahogany tables and family heirlooms that told the story of our ancestry. I looked at my son, expecting him to defend his mother's memory. Instead, Julian just adjusted his expensive watch and looked me dead in the eye with a chilling corporate coldness. "Chloe is right, Dad," Julian said without a trace of emotion. "We are hosting a massive launch party for my startup next month. We need the space to reflect success and innovation. You living here shuffling around looking sad all the time, it just does not fit the aesthetic we are going for anymore. You are holding us back, holding them back. I paid the property taxes. I paid the utility bills. I had even paid off Julian's massive credit card debts twice in the last 5 years." Julian reached behind the porch pillar and pulled out a single black plastic trash bag. He dropped it at my feet. It landed with a pathetic thud. "I packed your essentials," he said, handing me a folded piece of paper. "This is the address to the Pine Haven Care Facility. It is a state-run home, but it is perfectly adequate for your needs. I already paid for the first month. The car I called for you should be here any minute. You need to be around people your own age, Dad. You need medical supervision." Medical supervision. My mind raced. I was 74, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. My doctor had just told me I had the heart of a 50-year-old man. They were not sending me away for my health. They were discarding me because I was an inconvenience to their high society masquerade. A normal man would have screamed. A normal father would have slapped his son across the face, demanded respect, and ordered them off his property. But I am not a normal man. I spent my entire career calculating stress points, figuring out exactly how much weight a structure can take before it collapses. I looked at Julian and Chloe standing there on my porch, dripping with unearned arrogance, and I realized something vital. If I fought them now, they would just call the police, claim I was having a senile episode, and make my life miserable. If I kicked them out today, they would just move to another apartment and continue their pathetic facade of a life. That was not enough. They had thrown my wife's soul into a dumpster. They needed to lose everything. I looked at Julian's smug face and then at Chloe, who was already scrolling through her phone again, completely unbothered by the fact that she was tearing a family apart. I did not say a single word. I did not shed a single tear. I bent down slowly, ignoring the ache in my knees, and picked up the black trash bag containing a few of my shirts and pants. I clutched Vivian's photo album tightly under my left arm. I turned my back on my own son and walked down the long driveway toward the waiting car. I could feel their eyes on my back, likely celebrating their easy victory. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was too weak, too broken by grief to fight back. As I got into the back seat of the car, I looked out the window at the beautiful brick estate I had purchased decades ago. I watched Julian put his arm around Chloe, laughing about something as they walked back inside my house. The ride away from my estate felt like moving through thick water. The cab driver kept his eyes on the road, unbothered by the old man sitting in the back seat clutching a plastic trash bag. I did not give him the address Julian had written on that folded piece of paper. The Pine Haven Care Facility was a notorious dumping ground for forgotten seniors. I had read the local reports. It was a place where people went to fade away in sterile rooms smelling of bleach and neglect. I was not going to fade away. I leaned forward and told the driver to take me to a cheap motel off the interstate on the edge of the city. The cab pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the Starlight Motel. It was the kind of place that charged by the hour, with flickering neon signs and paint peeling off the exterior walls. It was a massive fall from the imported marble floors and vaulted ceilings of my home in Buckhead, but I needed a place to think. I needed a place where Julian and his arrogant wife Chloe could not track me. I paid the driver with a $20 bill from my wallet and stepped out into the humid Atlanta air. The lobby smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. A bored clerk chewing gum barely looked up from her magazine when I approached the plexiglass window. She asked for a credit card and an ID. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I wanted to transfer some funds from my primary checking account to a separate card so I would not leave a direct paper trail right away. That checking account was my operational fund. It was the account Vivian and I used to pay the property taxes, to handle the landscaping, and to cover our daily expenses. Just yesterday I had checked the balance. It was sitting comfortably at $40,000. It was more than enough to rent a decent place for a few months while I formulated my strategy to crush my son. I opened my banking application. The blue loading circle spun on the screen for a few seconds. When the numbers finally appeared, my heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. I blinked, staring at the bright white screen. The balance did not say $40,000. The balance read exactly $12.50. I refreshed the application. I closed it and opened it again. The numbers remained unchanged, $12.50. I clicked on the transaction history. A long list of massive transfers stared back at me. $5,000 withdrawn, $10,000 transferred to an external account, $15,000 wired to a boutique interior design firm. The entire account had been systematically drained over the last 48 hours. Every single transaction had been authorized by the joint account holder. My own son, Julian. The clerk tapped the glass impatiently, asking if I was going to pay or just stand there blocking her window. I swallowed the lump of pure rage forming in my throat. I reached into the hidden compartment of my wallet where I always kept a few crisp $100 bills for true emergencies. I slid the cash under the glass, took my room key, and walked out into the sticky heat. When I unlocked the door to my dingy motel room, I dropped my plastic trash bag on the floor. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress. The springs groaned under my weight. I stared at the blank wall opposite the bed, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. This was not just disrespect. This was financial annihilation. Julian had not just kicked me out of my own home. He had stripped me of my liquid assets to ensure I could not fight back. The drip-fed poison of betrayal began to burn in my veins. 5 years ago, when Vivian first got sick, I made a decision based on love and trust. I was spending all my time at the hospital, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, holding her hand while the chemotherapy ravaged her beautiful body. I needed someone to handle the household bills while I focused entirely on my wife. I went to the bank and added Julian to my primary checking account. I told him it was for emergencies only. I trusted my flesh and blood. I thought my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy I had sent to an expensive private university, would honor his father. Instead, he weaponized my trust. He waited until Vivian was gone. He waited until my grief was so heavy I could barely breathe. Then he married a woman who viewed my existence as an eyesore. And together they planned my execution. They did not want to just move me to a nursing home. They wanted to render me completely destitute. They wanted me to be just another broke, forgotten old man crying about his ungrateful children to nurses who did not care. Julian knew that if I had $40,000 in cash, I could hire a lawyer. I could fight the eviction. I could make his life very difficult. So he simply took the money before he handed me the trash bag. It was cold. It was calculated. It was the move of a predator. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of my thoughts. I took it out. It was a text message from Chloe. Even now, after throwing me out like garbage, she could not resist twisting the knife. She had to gloat. She had to make sure I knew she was the one in control. I opened the message. The words on the screen made my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. We used the funds for the demolition crew. Consider it back rent for living with us all these years. Have a nice life, Clifford. I read the message 3 times. The sheer audacity of her words was almost suffocating. Consider it back rent for living with us. They were living in my house, the house I bought with my sweat, the house I maintained, the house where I changed the plumbing and reinforced the foundation with my own 2 hands. They had lived there rent-free for a year because Julian claimed his tech startup was going through a rough patch. I had subsidized their luxury lifestyle. I had paid for the electricity that powered their expensive espresso machines. I had paid the water bill so Chloe could take her 2-hour-long soaking baths, and now she had the absolute nerve to claim I owed them rent. They used my money to hire a demolition crew to destroy Vivian's memory. They took the cash I had saved to tear down the walls my wife had painted. They were going to erase every trace of us from that property, and they were using my own bank account to fund their disgusting renovation. I placed the phone face down on the cheap laminate nightstand. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. Any other 74-year-old man would have broken down. Any other father would have called the police in a panic, crying about his stolen money. But calling the police for a joint bank account dispute is a civil matter. The police would look at the paperwork, see Julian's name on the account, and tell me there was nothing they could do. Julian knew that. He had planned this perfectly. He thought he was playing chess while the old man was playing checkers. But Julian forgot one very important detail about his father. I was a structural engineer. I spent 40 years calculating how things are built and, more importantly, how things collapse. I never built a structure without a secondary support system. I never designed a high-rise without a hidden failsafe. I applied the exact same logic to my personal finances. Julian thought the $40,000 in that checking account was my entire nest egg. He thought because I drove a 10-year-old car and wore sensible shoes that I was just a middle-class retiree living on a fixed pension. Chloe thought because I did not wear flashy watches or brag about stock portfolios that I was a poor old fool. They had no idea who I really was. They had no idea what kind of wealth Vivian and I had quietly amassed over 4 decades of smart investments and aggressive real estate acquisitions. They thought they had cut off my air supply, but they had only severed a single branch of a massive hidden tree. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. I bypassed the credit cards and the cash. I slipped my fingers into a small hidden slit in the leather lining. I pulled out a tiny micro SIM card. Then I walked over to the trash bag Julian had so graciously packed for me. I dug through the few shirts and trousers until I found a pair of heavy work boots I had owned for years. Hidden inside the toe of the left boot was a small, cheap, prepaid burner phone. I had purchased it months ago when I first noticed the subtle changes in Julian's behavior. When he started whispering in the hallways with Chloe, when they started asking unusual questions about the property deed. My intuition had warned me that a storm was coming. I had prepared my umbrella long before the first drop of rain fell. I inserted the micro SIM card into the burner phone and turned the device on. The screen lit up, casting a harsh glow in the dim motel room. This phone was not connected to my name. It was not linked to the household Wi-Fi. It was completely untraceable by Julian, the supposed tech genius. The phone caught a cellular signal. I opened the dialing pad. It was time to activate the contingency plan. It was time to show my arrogant son and his greedy wife that stealing $40,000 from me was the most expensive mistake they would ever make in their pathetic lives. I typed in a phone number I had memorized years ago, the number of a woman who did not deal in emotions or family drama, a woman who dealt in ruthless, absolute legal destruction. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the ringing tone. Julian and Chloe thought they had buried me. They thought they had thrown me into the trash along with Vivian's belongings. But they were about to learn a brutal lesson about the foundations of wealth. You do not survive 40 years in the commercial construction business by being soft. You survive by knowing exactly how to crush your enemies without leaving any fingerprints. The line clicked open. A sharp female voice answered the call. I did not say hello. I simply said it is time. The gloves are off. They took the bait. The silence in the motel room felt different now. It was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a predator locking onto its prey. Julian and Chloe wanted a war over aesthetics and money. They were going to get a war of annihilation. I sat back on the bed looking at the burner phone in my hand, ready to burn their entire world to the ground. I woke up the next morning on the sagging mattress of the Starlight Motel. The air conditioning unit rattled loudly against the stained wall, but I did not care. My mind was completely focused on the next step. Julian had drained my checking account, but he was a fool if he thought that was my only vulnerability. When a man like my son acts with that much brazen confidence, it means he believes he has already secured the grand prize. He did not just want $40,000. He wanted the entire kingdom. I opened my weathered leather briefcase and pulled out my laptop. I connected to the unstable motel internet and opened the county property tax portal. I needed to see exactly what kind of paper trail my son had left behind. For decades, I had navigated property laws, zoning permits, and real estate acquisitions. I knew how to dig through municipal databases faster than any young tech entrepreneur. I typed in the address of my Buckhead estate. The system took a few seconds to load the latest public filings. When the page finally refreshed, the text on the screen made my jaw lock. I stared at the digital document recorded just 48 hours ago. There it was, in black and white. A quitclaim deed. It is a legal document used to transfer interest in real estate rapidly. The document stated that Clifford Henderson relinquished all rights, titles, and interests in the property, transferring full ownership to Julian Henderson and his wife, Chloe Henderson. The property was valued at $3.5 million. I clicked on the scanned image of the document and zoomed in on the signature line. I stared at the fake signature. It lacked the sharp, precise angles I used when signing structural blueprints. Julian had not even tried to make it look authentic. He just scribbled my name, assuming nobody would ever double-check the paperwork of a grieving old man. He assumed the county clerks process thousands of these documents every week, and no one raises an eyebrow unless someone complains. He was betting on my silence and my ignorance. A notary stamp sat right next to it. Julian had forged my signature. He had found a corrupt or ignorant notary to stamp a fraudulent property transfer. My own flesh and blood had committed blatant forgery to steal my home. My chest tightened, but not from grief. It was the thrill of validation. Julian had just handed me the weapon I needed to destroy him. A forged deed is not just a family dispute, it is a massive legal violation. But Julian was arrogant. He assumed that because I was 74 years old, I would not understand how to check public records. He assumed I would be too busy crying in a state-run nursing home to realize he had stolen my $3 million estate. He thought he was a mastermind playing a brilliant game of real estate acquisition. He was nothing but an amateur thief playing in a yard he did not understand. I closed the laptop and placed it back in my briefcase. I needed to see what they were doing with my house. I needed to look my enemies in the eye from a safe distance. I rented an unmarked sedan from a cheap local agency using cash and a fake name. I drove back to my neighborhood in Buckhead, but I did not pull into my driveway. I parked down the street, completely hidden under the shade of a massive oak tree. The tinted windows of the rental car concealed my presence perfectly. I sat in the driver's seat and watched my own home. 30 minutes later, a pristine silver Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Ooh. The doors opened and out stepped Chloe, along with her parents, Richard and Susan Sterling. I recognized them immediately. Richard was wearing a pastel polo shirt and expensive loafers, looking like a man who spent his entire life living on credit and pretending to be wealthy. Susan stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses and a flashy designer dress, carrying a tiny lapdog in her purse. They had always looked down on Vivian and me. They thought because we were an African-American couple who preferred quiet evenings on the porch to flashy country club parties that we were somehow beneath them. They whispered behind our backs about how we did not belong in a neighborhood like Buckhead. They never knew my bank account was 10 times the size of theirs, and I bought that house in cash. I rolled down my window just a fraction of an inch to hear them. The crisp morning air carried their voices clearly across the manicured lawns. Susan pointed a manicured finger at my beautiful brick house. "Finally, we can fix this neighborhood," she stated loudly, her voice dripping with extreme arrogance. "We will make it our summer home." Richard nodded in agreement, placing his hands on his hips. "Julian promised us the guest wing once the renovations are done," Richard said. "It is about time that old man got out of the way." Chloe laughed, a sharp, grating sound that echoed down the street. "Do not worry, Mom," Chloe said happily. "We threw all his ghetto trash in the dumpster yesterday. The place is completely ours now." I watched them walk up my stone steps, acting like conquering royalty entering a newly captured palace. They truly believed they owned my house. They believed Julian had legally secured the property and that they were going to turn my ancestral home into their personal vacation retreat. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. They were going to strip the soul out of my house and replace it with their hollow, superficial aesthetics. But I did not feel defeated. I felt a cold, calculating sense of victory. They were celebrating a fantasy. It was time to introduce them to reality. I rolled the window up and picked up my burner phone. I dialed the private number of my trust and estate attorney. Her name was Renee. She was a 50-year-old African-American woman with a mind like a steel trap and a reputation for completely annihilating anyone who crossed her clients in the courtroom. She did not play games and she did not lose. The line rang twice before she answered. "Clifford," she said, her voice sharp and alert. "Tell me you are safe." "I am safe, Renee," I replied, my voice perfectly calm. "But Julian and Chloe have made their move. They drained my operational checking account and threw me out of the house." Renee let out a low whistle. "Those fools," she muttered. "Do you want me to send the police to the house right now? We can have them arrested for elder abuse and financial theft before lunchtime." "No," I said quickly. "Do not call the police. I want them to feel comfortable. I want them to think they have won." Renee paused. "What else did he do, Clifford?" I looked at the house, watching Richard and Susan inspecting my front door. "Julian filed a quitclaim deed yesterday," I told her. "He forged my signature and transferred the house into his and Chloe's names. Her parents are here right now planning out their new summer home." Renee burst into a loud, genuine laugh. "A forged deed?" she asked, her voice filled with dark amusement. "He actually filed a forged deed on that specific property." "Yes, he did," I replied, smiling in the dark car. Renee knew my secrets. She was the one who helped me set up my entire financial fortress 15 years ago. When my engineering firm started making massive profits, Vivian and I decided to protect our assets from any future liabilities or greedy relatives. We sat in Renee's office and created a blind corporate trust. The trust was an impenetrable legal entity registered in Delaware and entirely managed by a corporate holding company. On paper, the house belongs to Vanguard Holdings, LLC. I do not legally own that house. I have not owned it for 15 years. The trust owns it. I am merely the controlling beneficiary with absolute power to dictate what the holding company does. Julian forging my signature on a deed transferring the property was completely useless. He cannot transfer a house I do not legally own. But by filing that fraudulent paperwork with the county clerk, he had crossed a massive line. Filing a forged deed to steal a property worth over $3 million was not just a local crime. It was a massive federal offense. I spent my life designing buildings that could withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. I designed my finances the exact same way. Julian tried to knock down a load-bearing wall without realizing it was made of reinforced titanium. "He just handed us his head on a silver platter," Renee said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "The deed is legally void, but the act of filing it constitutes a federal crime. If he tries to leverage that deed for money, he is looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary." "Exactly," I said, watching the Mercedes parked in my driveway. "Let them renovate. Let them spend their money. Let them dig a federal-sized grave. I will call you when it is time to bury them." I sat in the unmarked rental car staring through tinted windows at my house. My lawyer Renee crackled through the speaker of my burner phone, furious, telling me we needed to call authorities right this second. She wanted to send local police to arrest Julian for forging the property deed. She wanted to lock Chloe out, pressing charges for the stolen $40,000. I listened to her breathe heavily, telling her absolutely not. Renee protested, arguing they were standing inside my multi-million-dollar estate, planning to rip out historic interiors. I kept my voice perfectly level, telling her if we stop them now, they just get a slap on the wrist. A local judge might look at Julian, seeing a desperate son making a mistake out of grief, getting probation or a suspended sentence. I did not want probation. I wanted absolute total destruction. I told her to let them renovate the house, spending their own money, making themselves perfectly comfortable. If we stop them now, they will just cry playing the victim. Let them dig a federal-sized grave. A forged deed is one thing, but leveraging it for a massive bank loan is a federal felony. Renee understood my plan, letting out a low chuckle, agreeing to hold off on the legal strike. I ended the call, starting the engine of my rental car. I had a destination to reach and a role to play. I drove away from the beautiful tree-lined streets of Buckhead, heading toward the address Julian wrote on that folded piece of paper. The drive took me to a neglected part of the city where roads were cracked and buildings looked exhausted. I pulled into the parking lot of the Pine Haven Care Facility. It looked exactly like the dumping ground I expected. The exterior was a faded gray cinder-block structure with barred windows and dying grass near the entrance. I parked out of sight behind a nearby strip mall, grabbing the single black trash bag containing my clothes. I walked toward the facility, forcing my shoulders to slump. I slowed my pace, dragging my feet slightly against the concrete, becoming the broken old man Julian believed me to be. I pushed open the heavy glass doors, walking into the reception area. The smell of cheap industrial bleach and boiled cabbage hit me instantly. A tired receptionist sat behind a scratched fiberglass counter, not even looking up from her computer screen when I approached. I placed the folded paper on the counter, making my hands tremble slightly as I spoke. I told her my son Julian sent me here. She typed a few things into her system, handing me intake forms. She spoke to me slowly and loudly as if I were a deaf child. I played along perfectly, holding the pen with a shaky grip, taking a very long time to sign my name. I let my eyes wander aimlessly around the room, acting confused and disoriented. A burly orderly came out, escorting me to my room. We walked down a dimly lit hallway with walls painted a depressing shade of pale green. I saw other residents sitting in wheelchairs, staring blankly at television screens, playing daytime soap operas. Julian had chosen the most miserable place he could find, wanting me to lose my mind in this sterile prison while he threw parties in my historic estate. The orderly opened the door to a cramped room with two narrow twin beds and a single barred window, telling me to unpack, waiting for the dinner bell. I thanked him in a weak, trembling voice. Once he closed the door, I sat on the thin, stiff mattress, surrounded by the exact misery my son had orchestrated for me. I did not feel depressed, feeling instead a surge of strategic clarity. I had successfully infiltrated the enemy lines. This miserable room was not my prison. It was my Trojan horse. To win a war against arrogant people, you must feed their arrogance until they choke on it. Over the next 3 days, I perfected my performance, shuffling down hallways, muttering to myself. I pretended to forget the names of nurses sitting in the communal dining hall, staring blankly at untouched trays of flavorless mashed potatoes. The facility staff completely bought my act, updating my medical chart, noting rapid cognitive decline and confusion. This was exactly what I needed, an official paper trail establishing Clifford Henderson was losing his mind. Julian had already paid for my first month here, but I knew he would eventually have to visit, ensuring his plan was working. On the 4th day, the visitor lounge door swung open. Julian and Chloe walked in looking completely out of place in expensive designer clothes. Chloe wrinkled her nose in disgust, waving a manicured hand, fanning away the smell of the facility. Julian looked around with a smug expression of superiority. I sat in a vinyl armchair by the window, wearing a faded cardigan, making sure my posture was completely hunched. I let my jaw hang slightly slack. Julian walked over, towering over me. He did not ask how I was doing or if the food was acceptable. He just crossed his arms, staring at me like a landlord inspecting a damaged property. "Well, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you look like you are settling in nicely. This place suits you." I looked up at him, slowly blinking several times as if trying to recognize my own son. "Julian, is that you?" I asked, my voice wavering perfectly. I patted the armrest, acting disoriented. "Where is Vivian?" I asked. "Did your mother come with you?" Julian let out a harsh laugh, looking at Chloe. Chloe smirked, shaking her head. "See, Julian," Chloe said loudly. "I told you his brain is completely fried. He does not even remember she is dead." Julian leaned down, placing his hands on the armrests of my chair, trapping me in. "Mom is gone." "Dad," he said, speaking slowly like a villain enjoying his victory. "You are here now. This is your home. You need to stay here, being a good boy." I whimpered, nodding in a pathetic motion. "Okay, Julian," I murmured. "Whatever you say." Julian smiled, an arrogant grin, standing back up, feeling victorious. By acting senile, I handed him confirmation of his brilliance. He believed he had broken me. He believed I was a harmless fool forgetting his dead wife. Believing I was broken, he lowered his guard, stopping viewing me as a threat. That was his fatal mistake. Arrogant people become sloppy when they think nobody is watching. Julian pulled out his smartphone right in front of me. He did not bother lowering his voice or stepping into the hallway. He dialed a number, putting the phone on speaker. Chloe stood next to him, complaining loudly about her shoes touching the dirty floor. A private contractor answered the line. Julian discussed renovation plans for my estate, telling the contractor to rip out the load-bearing wall separating the kitchen and dining room. He wanted an open-concept floor plan for his massive launch party next month. I sat looking blankly at the wall, recording every detail. That wall contained primary plumbing stacks and main electrical conduits for the second floor. Ripping it out without a permit would cost hundreds of thousands to fix. Julian was clueless about engineering making massive structural decisions on a property he did not legally own using stolen money. Chloe chimed in, demanding the contractor import Italian marble for the foyer. Julian told the contractor money was no object, bragging his investors were about to inject massive capital into his startup. He bragged about securing a brand new corporate line of credit. I listened to his every word, absorbing his arrogance. They discussed federal bank fraud right in front of me, thinking my brain was too far gone to comprehend. They thought I was a ghost. They did not realize the ghost was memorizing their playbook. I kept my head bowed, letting a small trail of drool escape my mouth just to sell the performance. Chloe looked at me, shuddering in disgust. "Let us get out of here, Julian," she said, grabbing his arm. "It smells like death in here, and he is grossing me out." Julian laughed, kissing her cheek. "Do not worry, babe," he said. "We never have to come back here again." The old man is done. They turned their backs, walking out of the visitor lounge, leaving me alone in the chair. The heavy metal doors clicked shut behind them. I wiped my mouth, sitting up straight. My posture corrected itself instantly. The confused look vanished from my eyes, replaced by the cold, sharp focus of a structural engineer analyzing a flawed blueprint. My Trojan horse strategy was working flawlessly. I was exactly where I needed to be, completely invisible and completely underestimated, ready to bring their empire crashing down. The Pine Haven Care Facility was a living nightmare designed for the forgotten. Every breath I took filled my lungs with the scent of industrial cleaner, masking the undeniable odor of human decay. The floors were sticky. The walls were painted a sickening shade of yellow that seemed to absorb all the natural light trying to peek through the filthy barred windows. I sat in a worn vinyl chair in the corner of my shared room, observing the absolute misery my son had condemned me to endure. My roommate was a man named Harold, who spent his days staring at a blank television screen, mumbling to people who had died decades ago. The nurses were underpaid and overworked, treating us not like human beings but like inventory to be managed. They would drop trays of gray, tasteless food on our tables and walk away without a single word of comfort. This was the exact environment Julian had chosen for me. He did not just want me out of my house. He wanted my spirit to break. He wanted me to wither away in this sterile prison so he could throw his high society parties without the guilt of seeing my face. But sitting in that vinyl chair, I felt no despair. I only felt a cold, calculating focus. Every terrible meal I forced down, every night I spent listening to the agonized coughs of the elderly, only solidified my resolve. I was an engineer. I knew how to wait for the perfect moment to let the concrete cure before applying the load. Julian believed he completely disarmed me when he drained my checking account and threw my clothes into a trash bag. He assumed an old man grieving his wife would lack the foresight to prepare for a financial execution. But hidden inside the thick leather sole of my right boot was a high-definition audio recording device. It was no larger than a coin, but could pick up a whisper from across the room. I purchased it months ago when the first shadows of greed began to darken my son's eyes. I knew the day would come when I would need undeniable proof of his treachery. Every morning, I carefully slid the device into the breast pocket of my faded cardigan. I kept it running, capturing the mundane misery of the facility, waiting for the predator to return. A greedy man is never satisfied with just the house. Greed is a bottomless pit that demands to be fed constantly. Julian thought he won, but he had no idea he was walking straight into a meticulously designed trap. I spent my days perfecting my performance. I practiced the vacant stare and perfected the slight tremor in my hands. I learned how to shuffle across the linoleum floor, dragging my left heel to look completely defeated. The medical staff documented my cognitive decline exactly as I wanted them to. The trap was set, and I just needed the rat to take the bait. On the 7th day of my miserable stay, the heavy door to the visitor lounge swung open, and the rat finally arrived. Julian walked in alone. Chloe was nowhere to be seen, likely too busy spending my money on imported Italian marble to bother visiting the ghetto clutter she had discarded. Julian wore a custom-tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than the monthly salary of the nurses working in this building. He looked completely out of place, surrounded by the peeling wallpaper and the stained furniture of the lounge. He scanned the room with a look of utter disgust until his eyes landed on me. I was sitting by the window staring blankly at the parking lot, holding a crumpled tissue in my trembling hands. I saw him smile. It was a cold, arrogant smile that confirmed everything I needed to know. He walked over to me, pulling up a plastic chair and sitting down. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask if I was being treated well. He leaned in close, his expensive cologne clashing violently with the smell of the nursing home. "Hello, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with a sickening false sweetness. "How are we doing today?" I slowly turned my head to look at him, letting my mouth hang slightly open. I blinked several times, acting as though it took me a full minute to recognize my own flesh and blood. "Julian," I whispered, my voice raspy and weak. "Did you bring Vivian with you?" "Where is your mother, Julian?" My son let out a sharp, cruel laugh. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "You really have lost it completely, have you not?" he muttered, crossing his arms. "Mom is gone, old man. But that is exactly why I am here today. We need to talk about what she left behind." I reached my trembling hand up to my chest, pressing my fingers gently against the fabric of my cardigan. Right beneath my fingertips, the tiny recording device was capturing every single word. "What do you mean, Julian?" I asked, letting my voice waver with manufactured confusion. "Vivian did not leave anything behind." "We have the house, Julian. We have the house." Julian leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees. His eyes narrowed completely, dropping the act of a caring son. "The house is mine now." "Dad," he said, his tone turning aggressive, "but we both know Mom had a private life insurance policy. I found the empty folder in her desk when Chloe and I were clearing out that garbage you call memories. I know the policy exists. I know it pays out $250,000. I need the passwords to her private accounts, Dad. I need the login credentials right now." I stared at him, maintaining my vacant expression, while my mind worked with sharp precision. There was no life insurance policy. Vivian and I had cashed out our small policies decades ago to fund our blind corporate trust. The empty folder he found was just an old file from the 1980s. But Julian was desperate. His tech startup was failing. The massive loan he was trying to secure required more collateral. He was drowning in debt and looking for any possible lifeline. "I do not know what you are talking about, Julian," I murmured, shaking my head slowly. "The passwords. Vivian always handled the passwords." Julian slammed his fist down on the armrest of my chair, causing a nearby nurse to look over. He quickly lowered his voice, glaring at me with pure hatred. "Do not play games with me, you senile old fool," he hissed. "I need that money. The renovation is bleeding me dry, and the bank is asking too many questions. Give me the passwords, or I will make sure the staff here forgets to bring you your meals." I let out a pathetic whimper, shrinking back into my chair, acting completely terrified of his threat. "I do not have the money, Julian," I pleaded, my voice cracking perfectly. "The house is all I have. Please give me my house back, Julian. I did not sign any papers. I did not give you my house." Julian let out a dark, mocking chuckle. He leaned so close I could feel his breath on my face. His arrogance finally overpowered his sense of caution. "You are right, Dad," he whispered maliciously. "You did not sign anything. I forged your signature, old man. I faked the deed and the county clerk swallowed it whole. And what are you going to do about it? Who is going to believe a dementia patient rotting in a state-run facility over a successful tech CEO? You are a ghost, Clifford. You own nothing. You are nothing. Give me the passwords, or I swear you will die in this room." I looked into the eyes of the boy I had raised, the boy I had protected and provided for. There was no soul left inside him. There was only a parasite feeding on my legacy. I slowly lowered my head, letting out a defeated sigh. "I do not know the passwords, Julian," I whispered. "I am sorry." Julian stood up abruptly, kicking the leg of my chair. "You are useless," he spat, turning his back on me. "I will find the money myself. Have a miserable life, old man." I watched him storm out of the visitor lounge, pushing past the heavy glass doors without looking back. Once he was gone, I sat perfectly still. I took a deep breath, feeling a rush of absolute victory coursing through my veins. He had just handed me the key to his prison cell, and he did not realize it. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pressed my thumb against the small device. I quietly hit save. The trap was locked and the countdown to his destruction had begun. The Pine Haven Care Facility operates on a rigid schedule. I spent 5 agonizing days observing the night shift rotation, watching the staff move like clockwork. At 2 in the morning, the main corridor becomes abandoned. The orderly sleeps in the break room, and the night nurse watches television with the volume turned low. I sat on my stiff mattress, waiting patiently in the dark. I wore dark clothing kept hidden at the bottom of my trash bag. I slipped my feet into my heavy work boots, feeling the solid weight of the recording device safely tucked inside the sole. I opened the door to my room, moving silently like a shadow. Harold, my roommate, was snoring loudly, masking any sound I made. I walked down the pale green hallway, keeping my back pressed against the cold wall, avoiding the squeaking floorboards I had memorized during my daytime shuffles. I reached the side exit door near the laundry room. It was locked with a basic magnetic keypad. Julian thought I was a helpless old man, but he forgot I designed security infrastructure for commercial high-rises. I bypassed the lock 3 days ago using a piece of plastic cut from a meal tray wedged firmly into the strike plate. I pushed the heavy metal door and stepped out into the humid Atlanta night. The air hit my face, feeling like absolute freedom. I walked briskly across the asphalt parking lot, disappearing into the shadows of the nearby strip mall where my unmarked rental car was waiting silently in the dark. I started the engine, listening to the quiet hum of the sedan. I drove out of the neglected neighborhood, heading back toward the wealthy tree-lined streets of Buckhead. The city was completely asleep, but my mind was operating at maximum capacity, analyzing every variable. I needed eyes and ears inside my own home. Julian and Chloe thought they successfully locked me out, but a structural engineer never hands over a building without keeping a master key. During the initial construction of the estate decades ago, I installed a secondary service entrance hidden behind the dense ivy trellis on the east wing. It was a heavy steel door I used for contractors and private deliveries. I kept the physical brass key buried in a magnetic lockbox under a loose brick near the garden wall. I drove past the main entrance of my estate, parking the rental car 2 blocks away in a quiet cul-de-sac. I walked the rest of the distance, staying off the main illuminated sidewalks, moving like a ghost through the manicured lawns of my wealthy neighbors. I reached the edge of my property, stepping over the low stone wall Vivian and I built together. The house loomed in the dark, a massive brick fortress now occupied by parasites who thought they had won. I moved silently through the dense garden, navigating by memory alone. I reached the east wing, pushing aside the thick ivy vines. The hidden service door was exactly where I left it, untouched and unnoticed. Julian, with his arrogant tech CEO mindset, probably spent thousands on digital alarm systems for the front doors, but he had no idea this manual contractor entrance even existed. I knelt down, digging my fingers into the cool, damp earth near the loose brick. I pulled out the small magnetic lockbox, wiping away the thick dirt. I opened it, retrieving the heavy brass key. I slid the key into the lock, turning it with a soft, mechanical click. The heavy door swung open effortlessly, revealing the dark, silent interior of my own home. I stepped inside, gently closing the door behind me, ensuring it locked properly. The air inside the house felt entirely different now. It smelled of expensive imported paint and Chloe's overly sweet floral perfume. They had already begun tearing away the soul of the house, trying to erase my existence completely. I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket, keeping the beam pointed low to the ground. I had a bag slung over my shoulder containing 4 high-definition microcameras. They were motion-activated wireless devices I purchased with cash during my brief stop at the motel. I moved through the service corridor, entering the main living room. The beam of my flashlight swept across the expansive living space, and my chest tightened with a familiar cold rage. Chloe had not wasted a single minute destroying Vivian's legacy. The beautiful hand-carved mahogany tables were entirely gone. The vibrant Ghanaian tapestries Vivian loved so much had been stripped from the walls, replaced by sterile, cold gray paint. It looked like the lobby of a soulless corporate office rather than a family home. But I did not have time to mourn furniture right now. I had a mission to execute flawlessly. I walked over to the newly installed floating shelves on the far wall. I took the first micro camera, a device no larger than a button, and attached it discreetly behind a heavy modern vase Chloe had placed there. It had a perfect unobstructed view of the entire living room and the main staircase. I moved to the dining area, attaching the second camera underneath the edge of the large chandelier mounting bracket facing downward. I needed to see who came and went. I needed to hear every conversation, every arrogant boast, every financial plot they hatched in the safety of their stolen kingdom. They thought they were untouchable, living in a fortress they did not earn. But I was turning their luxury palace into a surveillance trap, recording their crimes. With the living areas completely secured, I crept up the main staircase, carefully avoiding the third step that always creaked loudly. I moved toward the master study, my personal home office located at the end of the long hallway. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar. I slipped inside, pulling the door shut silently behind me. Julian had completely taken over the room, turning it into his command center. My antique oak desk had been dragged out, replaced by a sleek glass and metal monstrosity. Multiple computer monitors covered the surface, glowing with sleeping screensavers illuminating the dark room. I pulled the third micro camera from my bag, mounting it high up on the top corner of the bookshelf, directly overlooking the desk and the computer screens. I needed to see exactly what Julian was typing and who he was calling when he thought he was alone. I moved toward the desk to plant the final camera, but my flashlight beam caught something highly interesting spread out across the glass surface. They were large architectural blueprints printed on thick, heavy paper covered in red ink notes. I leaned over, examining the detailed documents closely. These were not just simple, superficial remodeling sketches. These were massive structural renovation plans submitted by a very expensive high-end contracting firm based in Atlanta. I ran my flashlight over the detailed schematics. They planned to gut the east wing, tearing down load-bearing walls to install a custom indoor pool and a 2-story glass atrium. The sheer cost of this ambitious project would be astronomical, easily pushing over $500,000. Julian was bankrupt, and his tech startup was rapidly failing. He did not have this money, even with fraudulent bank loans. I moved my light toward financial documents clipped to the back of the blueprints. There were bank transfer receipts and signed investment contracts. I read the names printed boldly on the documents, and a cold smile spread across my face. The names were Richard and Susan Sterling, Chloe's arrogant parents who loved looking down on me. The legal documents clearly outlined that Richard and Susan were pouring their entire retirement savings into this ridiculous renovation. Exactly $300,000 had been wired directly to the contracting firm yesterday morning. The contracts drafted by Julian stated that in exchange for fully funding the renovation, Richard and Susan would receive a 50% ownership stake in the estate. They truly believed Julian legally owned the house because of the forged deed. They believed their $300,000 was securing their luxurious summer home and protecting their generational wealth. They liquidated their entire life savings, emptying their pension funds to buy half of a $3 million estate that actually belonged to a blind corporate trust I completely controlled. I pulled my burner phone from my pocket, taking crisp photos of every document on the desk. Every contract, every transfer, every blueprint signature. Julian was not just stealing from me. He was actively scamming his own wealthy in-laws. He was committing massive wire fraud, using my property as bait to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from Richard and Susan. They were all digging their own graves, throwing money into a void they could never recover. I smiled, stepping back into the shadows, leaving the house as I found it ready to watch them burn. I slipped back into the Pine Haven Care Facility long before sunrise. The magnetic lock clicked softly as I pushed the heavy door shut behind me. I moved like a shadow down the pale green hallway. The night nurse was still asleep in the break room, her head resting on a stack of medical charts. I reached my room and opened the door without making a single sound. Harold was still snoring loudly in his narrow bed, oblivious to my movements. I sat on my stiff mattress, retrieving the burner phone from my work boots. I connected the device to the cellular network and opened the surveillance application. The screen flickered for a brief second before 4 high-definition camera feeds illuminated the dark corners of my miserable room. I was sitting in a rotting state-run nursing home, but my eyes were staring directly into the heart of my stolen kingdom. The morning sun filled the living room on the first camera feed. I watched the screen with cold, calculating patience. At 9 o'clock, the front door swung open and Chloe walked in, accompanied by her parents Richard and Susan Sterling. They were holding expensive coffees and pointing at the walls like conquerors dividing their spoils. I tapped the screen to unmute the audio feed. The tiny microphone hidden behind the heavy vase picked up their voices with absolute crystal clarity. Susan walked into the living room holding her tiny lapdog spinning around. She wore a bright pink designer dress that looked completely ridiculous. Richard followed closely behind her, carrying a leather briefcase, looking victorious. I turned the volume up slightly, pressing the speaker close to my ear. Susan laughed loudly, pointing toward the empty space where my wife Vivian used to hang our Ghanaian tapestries. I am glad Julian got rid of all that cheap African art, Susan said, her voice dripping with pure arrogant racism. It made the entire house look like a discount flea market. I could not believe they actually displayed those dirty-looking masks and woven rugs in a neighborhood like Buckhead. It was completely inappropriate for a house of this magnitude. Chloe smiled, sipping her green matcha latte. I know, Mom, Chloe agreed. Julian was sentimental, but I told him we could not entertain investors with that junk hanging on the walls. We threw it all in the dumpster where it belongs. Now we can finally put up some tasteful modern art. Richard walked over to my custom-built wet bar and opened the glass cabinets. He pulled out a bottle of 20-year-old scotch I had been saving for a special occasion. He poured himself a massive glass without hesitation. He took a long sip, sighing in deep satisfaction. You have to hand it to the old man, Richard said. He had terrible taste in decorations, but he certainly knew how to stock a liquor cabinet. It is a shame he lost his mind, but it is convenient for us. We poured our entire $300,000 retirement fund into this renovation, Chloe. Your father and I are completely broke on paper right now. But owning half of this $3 million estate guarantees we will never have to worry about money again. This house is our ultimate safety net. I sat in the dark nursing home room listening to the sheer volume of their ignorance. They mocked the cheap African art without realizing those artifacts were authentic 17th century Ashanti ceremonial masks imported from West Africa. They were appraised at over $80,000 each. Chloe and Julian threw hundreds of thousands of dollars of priceless history into a dumpster. And Richard just admitted on a recorded line that he liquidated his life savings to renovate a house belonging to a blind corporate trust. They were racist, arrogant thieves dancing blindly on the deck of a sinking ship. I did not feel angry. I felt the pure, unadulterated satisfaction of an engineer watching a flawed structure stress-testing itself right before a catastrophic collapse. I switched my attention to the third camera feed located in my home office. Julian sat at my antique oak desk running his hands through his hair. He looked exhausted. The polished exterior of the successful tech chief executive officer was completely gone when he was alone. He stared at computer monitors surrounded by stacks of financial documents. I unmuted the office camera, focusing entirely on my son. Julian picked up his sleek smartphone and dialed a number, placing it on speaker mode. An automated voice announced he was calling a federal bank located in New York. The system routed his call to a loan officer. I leaned closer to the screen, memorizing every detail. Good morning, Mr. Henderson, the loan officer said. I am calling to finalize the details on your home equity line of credit application. We received the quitclaim deed you submitted showing the property is fully owned by you and your wife, Chloe Henderson. The appraisal came back at $3.5 million, covering the $500,000 line of credit you are requesting. Julian let out a massive sigh of relief. That is fantastic news, Julian said, his voice trembling slightly with desperation. My startup is expanding, and we need this $500,000 transferred into our corporate accounts immediately to cover payroll. How soon can we finalize the wire transfer? The loan officer paused, typing loudly. We must run a final compliance check since funds are crossing state lines from New York to Georgia, the officer explained. We will execute the wire transfer by the end of the business week. You are leveraging the entire estate as collateral, Mr. Henderson. If your startup defaults on this loan, the bank will foreclose on the property. I assume you understand the terms. I understand completely, Julian replied. The house is fully mine. There are no other claims on the deed. Send the money as soon as the compliance check clears. Julian ended the call, dropping his head into his hands. He let out a shaky laugh, whispering to himself that he had finally saved his company. I stared at the screen, feeling the cold weight of absolute victory settling into my bones. Julian had just initiated a $500,000 bank loan using my stolen house as collateral. Because the money was being wired across state lines to Georgia, he had just triggered federal jurisdiction. He submitted the forged quitclaim deed as proof of ownership to a federal bank. He escalated his crime from local real estate fraud to massive federal wire fraud. Federal wire fraud carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary per count. Julian had just locked the doors to his own prison cell and handed the key directly to me. I pulled out my burner phone and opened a secure encrypted messaging application. I typed a long, detailed message to my attorney, Renee, outlining exactly what I had just witnessed. I gave her the name of the federal bank, the exact loan amount, and the timeline for the wire transfer. I told her to contact associates within the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. I instructed her not to stop the bank from transferring the money. If the bank flagged the forged deed now, Julian would simply be rejected for the loan and face minor local charges for attempting to file false paperwork. I needed the transaction to be fully executed. I needed the $500,000 to hit his corporate account across state lines. Once that money landed, his federal crime would be fully completed. Renee replied 2 minutes later with a single brief message. "The trap is set, Clifford. We let him take the money. The federal agents will be waiting." I locked the phone, placing it back inside my boot. I lay back on the stiff mattress, folding my hands across my chest. The horrible smell of the facility no longer bothered me. The sound of Harold snoring in the next bed faded into the background. I closed my eyes, visualizing the structural blueprint of Julian and Chloe and their arrogant in-laws. They built a massive tower of lies fueled by racism and relentless greed. They thought they discarded me, leaving me to rot while they lived like royalty. I quietly removed every supporting column from their foundation. They were standing on empty air, celebrating a fortune they did not own, spending money they had to steal. All I had to do now was wait for gravity to take over. I drifted into a peaceful, deep sleep, knowing that when I finally woke up, it would be time to initiate the total and complete destruction of the rats infesting my home. The game was no longer about simple revenge. It was about absolute justice. They would pay for every single ounce of pain they had caused my beloved family and my beautiful late wife. 2 days after I recorded Julian securing his fraudulent bank loan, I initiated the next phase of my strategy. I complained of severe tooth pain to secure a medical transport to an off-site dental clinic. The medical transport van dropped me off at a local clinic. The moment the driver drove away, I walked straight out at the back door of the clinic. A sleek black town car was waiting for me in the alleyway. The rear door opened and I slid into the leather seat next to my attorney, Renee. She handed me a fresh, tailored suit and told me to change quickly. We were not going to a dental appointment. We were heading to a highly secure conference room in downtown Atlanta to meet with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the chief fraud investigator for a major New York bank. I slowly changed out of my faded nursing home cardigan and put on the expensive charcoal gray suit. When I stepped out of the town car and walked into the glass and steel skyscraper, I was no longer a helpless dementia patient. I was Clifford Henderson, the multi-millionaire structural engineer, and I was about to order a federal strike on my own blood. Renee led me into a soundproof conference room on the 40th floor. Sitting around a massive mahogany table were 2 men. One was a sharp-looking federal agent named Miller. The other was a nervous, sweating executive from the bank Julian was attempting to defraud. Renee placed my laptop on the table and opened the encrypted files I had sent her. She displayed photographs of the forged quitclaim deed, the recorded audio of Julian admitting to the forgery, and the video feeds of him applying for the loan. Agent Miller reviewed the files, taking meticulous notes. The bank executive wiped his forehead, looking terrified at the sheer liability his institution was taking on. "This is a disaster," he stammered loudly. "The deed is fraudulent and our underwriters already approved the loan. Your son is attempting to leverage a property belonging to a blind corporate trust. If this loan defaults, we have zero legal recourse. We must freeze the account immediately. I will call our legal department right now and place a hard stop on the $500,000 wire transfer. We cannot allow those funds to be dispersed to his startup." He reached for his phone, ready to shut down Julian and his entire financial scheme. I reached across the table and placed my hand firmly over his device. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression completely cold and unyielding. "You will do absolutely nothing," I told him, my voice echoing in the quiet conference room. "You will not freeze the account and you will not stop the wire transfer. You are going to approve the loan and you are going to send my son every single penny of that $500,000. The bank executive stared at me as if I had truly lost my mind. Are you insane? He asked, his voice raising in panic. He is stealing $500,000 using your stolen property as collateral. If we transfer those funds, it is pure theft. We have to stop him today before the money leaves our vault. I shook my head slowly, leaning back in my chair. I turned my attention to Agent Miller, who was watching me with a calculated, evaluating gaze. I am an engineer, I explained calmly to the room. When you want to demolish a corrupt building, you do not just chip away at the exterior paint. You place the explosives deep inside the foundational pillars and you wait until the structural integrity is completely compromised before you push the detonator. If you freeze that bank account right now, Julian will simply claim it was a clerical error. A smooth-talking defense attorney will argue my son was just confused about paperwork. A local judge might feel sorry for him and hand him a suspended sentence. He will walk away and he will try to destroy me again. I will not allow him to walk away. I looked directly at Agent Miller, making sure he understood the exact legal trap I was constructing. The money has to cross state lines, I stated firmly. The bank is headquartered in New York. Julian is receiving the funds here in Georgia. He submitted a forged property deed across state lines to a federally insured institution. If you stop the wire transfer, it is just an attempt at local fraud. But the very second that $500,000 leaves New York and lands in his corporate startup account in Atlanta, the crime is fully executed. It instantly upgrades from a local white-collar misdemeanor to a massive federal felony. Interstate wire fraud carries a mandatory minimum of 20 years in federal prison. I want him to take the money. I want him to spend a few $1,000s on his ridiculous launch party. Let him feel victorious. Let him feel untouchable. Because when you finally kick his door down, you will not be arresting a confused son making a paperwork mistake. You will be arresting a federal criminal who orchestrated a massive interstate bank heist. The room fell completely silent. The bank executive swallowed hard, looking back and forth between me and the federal agent. Renee sat next to me, a predatory smile forming. She knew exactly how my mind worked, enjoying the destruction I was preparing. Agent Miller leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. He looked at the photographs of the forged deed and then looked back at me. A slow smile spread across his face. "Mr. Henderson," the agent said, his voice filled with deep professional respect. "You are a very dangerous man to cross. I like the way you build a case. We have everything we need to secure the federal warrants, but we need the transaction to clear to make the charges completely airtight." He turned to the sweating bank executive. "Let the wire transfer proceed," Agent Miller ordered. "Do not flag the account. Do not notify the applicant. Release the $500,000 to Julian Henderson by Friday morning. We will monitor the funds the moment they hit his Atlanta account." The bank executive nodded, nervously agreeing to comply with the federal directive. The trap was officially armed. The explosives were placed firmly at the foundation of my son and his arrogant lifestyle. We spent the next hour finalizing the timeline. Agent Miller promised to have tactical teams ready on standby. Renee drafted the final legal documents required to completely seize control of the corporate trust the moment the arrests were made. I shook hands with the federal agent, feeling a profound sense of justice settling into my chest. Julian and Chloe threw my wife Vivian and her beautiful memories into a rusted metal dumpster. They looked me in the eye and told me I was nothing but ghetto clutter, holding them back from their high society dreams. They thought they were sending me away to die quietly in a room smelling of bleach and forgotten lives. But I had just sat in a skyscraper and coordinated a federal strike that would eradicate their freedom, their finances, and their future. I walked out of the conference room with Renee taking the elevator down to the waiting town car. I changed back into my faded, worn-out cardigan and stepped back into my heavy work boots with the hidden recording device. The town car dropped me off a few blocks away from the dental clinic. I shuffled into the waiting room, sitting quietly in the corner until the transport van returned to pick me up. The driver complained about my long appointment, but I simply gave him a confused, blank stare, acting like the helpless old fool my son believed me to be. When I returned to the Pine Haven Care Facility, I walked through the heavy glass doors, dragging my feet against the linoleum floor. I ate the terrible gray food they served for dinner, chewing slowly while staring at the peeling yellow paint on the walls. Harold was mumbling in his sleep across the room, unaware of the massive storm brewing just outside our barred window. I lay on my stiff mattress, listening to the steady hum of the air conditioning unit. I closed my eyes, visualizing Julian sitting in my home office, refreshing his corporate bank account, waiting for his stolen money to arrive. He was probably planning his luxurious startup launch party, buying expensive champagne and ordering custom decorations. He had no idea that every dollar he spent was another nail in his federal coffin. I smiled in the dark, letting the sweet taste of impending vengeance wash over me. The trap was perfectly laid. The bait was taken. I just had to wait a few more long days for the final catastrophic collapse. My own son handed me a single black trash bag containing my clothes and told me I no longer fit the aesthetic of my own home. His wife stood on the porch of the multi-million-dollar Atlanta estate I paid for, complaining about the ghetto clutter she had just tossed into an industrial dumpster. That clutter was my late wife Vivian's entire legacy. They pointed me to a rundown state facility and told me to disappear. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply turned around and walked away. But what those two fools did not realize was that a retired structural engineer knows exactly which load-bearing walls to knock out to make a house collapse. Before I tell you how I tore their perfect lives down to the foundation, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your parents should always come with a devastating price. My name is Clifford Henderson, and I am 74 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer building commercial high-rises across the country while quietly investing every spare dollar into real estate. Vivian and I built a quiet, beautiful life together. We did not flaunt our wealth. We wore simple clothes, drove reliable cars, and poured our love into our only son, Julian. When Vivian passed away suddenly last year, my world went completely dark. The quiet of our massive, historic brick estate in Buckhead, Atlanta became suffocating. So when Julian asked to move in temporarily with his new wife, Chloe, I made the biggest mistake a grieving father could make. I said yes. I thought having family close would heal the void in my chest. I thought Julian, who was struggling to get his tech startup off the ground, needed his father. I was wrong. They did not want a father. They wanted a free luxury hotel and an ATM. The true nightmare began on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. I was returning home from a routine checkup with my cardiologist. The car pulled up to my long, circular driveway, and my heart instantly dropped into my stomach. Sitting right on the curb, crushing the manicured grass Vivian used to meticulously care for, was a massive, rusted industrial dumpster. I stepped out of the car, my knees feeling heavy. I walked toward the steel bin and looked over the edge. What I saw inside made my breath catch in my throat. It was not old furniture or construction debris. It was Vivian. There, buried under discarded cardboard boxes and empty iced coffee cups, was her vintage Singer sewing machine, the one she used to mend Julian's torn jeans when he was a little boy. Next to it were her favorite floral dresses, the ones that still faintly smelled of her signature lavender perfume. And scattered across the top like meaningless trash were our family photo albums. Decades of memories, vacations, birthdays, anniversaries just tossed away like garbage. I reached in with trembling hands and pulled out one of the heavy leather-bound albums, brushing the dirt off the cover. My chest tightened with an agonizing grief that quickly morphed into something entirely different. A cold, hard rage began to freeze the blood in my veins. I turned toward the house. Standing on the expansive wraparound porch were Julian and Chloe. Chloe was wearing expensive designer athletic wear, holding a green matcha latte, looking at her phone. Julian stood beside her, wearing a crisp, tailored suit, looking every bit the successful tech CEO he pretended to be. I walked up the stone steps, my face a blank mask. "What is the meaning of this, Julian?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Chloe rolled her eyes and took a sip of her drink before Julian could even speak. "Oh my God, Clifford, please do not make a scene!" She sighed in that condescending, high-pitched tone she always used with me. "We are remodeling the entire ground floor. This house is a historic gem, but the interior was completely ruining our vibe. We had to purge all that old ghetto clutter. It was frankly embarrassing to have our investors over with all those dusty doilies and ancient junk everywhere. Ghetto clutter." She was referring to African artifacts Vivian and I had imported from Ghana. She was referring to hand-carved mahogany tables and family heirlooms that told the story of our ancestry. I looked at my son, expecting him to defend his mother's memory. Instead, Julian just adjusted his expensive watch and looked me dead in the eye with a chilling corporate coldness. "Chloe is right, Dad," Julian said without a trace of emotion. We are hosting a massive launch party for my startup next month. We need the space to reflect success and innovation. You living here shuffling around looking sad all the time, it just does not fit the aesthetic we are going for anymore. You are holding us back, holding them back. I paid the property taxes, I paid the utility bills. I had even paid off Julian's massive credit card debts twice in the last 5 years. Julian reached behind the porch pillar and pulled out a single black plastic trash bag. He dropped it at my feet. It landed with a pathetic thud. "I packed your essentials," he said, handing me a folded piece of paper. "This is the address to the Pine Haven Care Facility. It is a state-run home, but it is perfectly adequate for your needs. I already paid for the first month. The car I called for you should be here any minute. You need to be around people your own age, Dad. You need medical supervision." Medical supervision. My mind raced. I was 74, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. My doctor had just told me I had the heart of a 50-year-old man. They were not sending me away for my health. They were discarding me because I was an inconvenience to their high society masquerade. A normal man would have screamed. A normal father would have slapped his son across the face, demanded respect, and ordered them off his property. But I am not a normal man. I spent my entire career calculating stress points, figuring out exactly how much weight a structure can take before it collapses. I looked at Julian and Chloe standing there on my porch, dripping with unearned arrogance, and I realized something vital. If I fought them now, they would just call the police, claim I was having a senile episode, and make my life miserable. If I kicked them out today, they would just move to another apartment and continue their pathetic facade of a life. That was not enough. They had thrown my wife's soul into a dumpster. They needed to lose everything. I looked at Julian's smug face, and then at Chloe, who was already scrolling through her phone again, completely unbothered by the fact that she was tearing a family apart. I did not say a single word. I did not shed a single tear. I bent down slowly, ignoring the ache in my knees, and picked up the black trash bag containing a few of my shirts and pants. I clutched Vivian's photo album tightly under my left arm. I turned my back on my own son and walked down the long driveway toward the waiting car. I could feel their eyes on my back, likely celebrating their easy victory. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was too weak, too broken by grief to fight back. As I got into the back seat of the car, I looked out the window at the beautiful brick estate I had purchased decades ago. I watched Julian put his arm around Chloe, laughing about something as they walked back inside my house. I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress inside my cramped room at the Pine Haven Care Facility. The morning sun barely penetrated the filthy glass of the barred window. My burner phone was safely tucked inside the thick sole of my heavy work boot. I had spent the last 2 days monitoring the hidden camera feeds from my estate. The trap with the federal bank was perfectly set, but Julian hit a minor roadblock. I watched him on the camera feed in my home office, pacing back and forth across the imported rugs. He was holding his sleek smartphone to his ear, looking completely frantic. The federal bank had processed the $500,000 loan application, but the compliance department flagged the sudden property transfer. Because I was 74 years old and had allegedly signed over a $3 million estate entirely for free, the bank required a basic medical clearance. They needed a licensed physician to certify that Clifford Henderson was of sound mind when he signed the quitclaim deed, or they needed a doctor to officially declare me mentally incompetent so Julian could finalize the paperwork as my legal guardian. Julian was furious. He slammed his fist against my antique mahogany desk, cursing loudly. He knew he could not bring a legitimate doctor to examine me. A real medical professional would take one look at my cognitive tests and immediately realize I was perfectly sane. A real doctor would ask me questions and I would tell them my son forged my signature. Julian needed a corrupted professional. He needed a doctor who cared more about cash than the Hippocratic Oath. I watched him scroll through his contacts and dial a new number. He spoke in hushed tones, demanding an immediate evaluation at the nursing home. He offered a $5,000 cash bonus for a signature on a mental incompetence form. The man on the other end of the line agreed. Julian smiled a deeply arrogant smile, thinking he had just solved his final problem. He had no idea I was watching his every move, preparing a counterattack that would shatter his confidence. I knew exactly how to play this. I shuffled down the pale green hallway of the nursing home, heading toward the visitor lounge. The smell of boiled cabbage and industrial bleach turned my stomach, but I ignored it. I sat in my usual vinyl chair by the window, letting my shoulders slump forward. I let my jaw hang slightly slack, staring blankly at the television mounted on the wall. I slowed my breathing, entering the mindset of a broken, forgotten old man. 10 minutes later, the heavy doors of the lounge swung open. Julian marched into the room looking desperate and rushed. Right behind him walked a tall, thin man carrying a black leather medical bag. He wore a wrinkled white coat over a cheap suit. His eyes darted around the depressing room, looking completely out of place and highly uncomfortable. This was the corrupt doctor Julian had purchased. Julian approached my chair, pointing a finger at me. "There he is," Dr. Julian said, his voice loud and condescending. "My father, Clifford Henderson. As you can see, he is completely gone. He does not even know what day it is. I need you to sign the competency evaluation forms right now so I can send them to the bank. The loan officer is waiting for the fax." The man pulled a clipboard from his bag. He stepped closer to me, looking down with an expression of pure boredom. "Hello, Clifford," the man said, speaking very slowly. "Can you tell me your name? Can you tell me where you are right now?" I kept my eyes fixed on the television screen. I let out a low, pathetic moan, letting my head loll to the side. I muttered a few incoherent words, pretending to look for my late wife, Vivian. Julian rolled his eyes, sighing heavily. "See," Julian said, crossing his arms. "He is a vegetable. He has severe dementia. He signed some property paperwork a few weeks ago before he completely lost his mind, but the bank is being ridiculous about the compliance checks. I just need you to sign the declaration of incompetence so I can take over his estate legally. I have the $5,000 in cash waiting for you in my car. Just sign the paper and we can both get out of this miserable place." The doctor nodded, pulling a silver pen from his pocket. He did not check my pulse. He did not ask me any actual medical questions. He did not conduct a single cognitive test. He simply placed the pen on the thick stack of legal documents Julian handed him. "It is a tragedy when the mind goes," the doctor said, mechanically preparing to forge a medical evaluation for a bribe. "I will sign the declaration of severe cognitive decline. You will have full guardianship over his financial decisions by this afternoon." The doctor lowered his pen toward the signature line. The ink was about to touch the paper. I did not move my head. I did not raise my voice. I simply shifted my gaze away from the television and locked my eyes directly onto the corrupt doctor. "Dr. Eris Thorne," I said, my voice completely clear, perfectly articulated, and carrying the heavy commanding tone of a senior structural engineer. "License number 48291. Currently under investigation by the State Medical Board for overprescribing narcotics and falsifying insurance claims in Fulton County." The pen stopped inches from the paper. The doctor froze completely. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He looked at me as if a corpse had just sat up and started reciting poetry. Julian took a step back, his mouth falling open in utter disbelief. I slowly sat up straight in the vinyl chair. The hunched posture vanished instantly. The slack jaw tightened into a fierce, unyielding line. I placed my hands firmly on the armrest, radiating absolute authority. I looked at the terrified doctor and let a cold, calculating smile spread across my face. "You are making a very serious mistake, Dr. Thorne," I said, speaking with pristine clarity. "My son offered you $5,000 to sign a fraudulent declaration of mental incompetence. If your pen touches that paper, you will not just lose your medical license. You will be indicted for federal conspiracy to commit bank fraud." The doctor dropped his pen. It clattered against the linoleum floor. He stared at me, his face turning a sickly shade of pale white. You are not," he stammered, taking a full step away from my chair. "I am in perfect cognitive health," I stated loudly, ensuring the nurses at the nearby station could hear the timbre of my voice. "My heart rate is resting at 60 beats per minute. My blood pressure is 120/80. I possess a genius-level intelligence quotient, and I spent 40 years designing commercial skyscrapers. I know exactly who you are, Dr. Thorne. I know about the malpractice lawsuit you settled out of court last year. I know my son just offered you a cash bribe. And most importantly, my attorney has already forwarded your name to a contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Julian looked like he was going to vomit. He looked back and forth between me and the doctor, completely panicked. "Dad, what are you doing?" he said, stumbling over his words. "You are confused. You are having an episode." I turned my sharp gaze toward my son. "Shut your mouth, Julian," I commanded. My voice cracked through the visitor lounge like a whip. You brought a paid-off hack into this facility to steal my sovereignty because the federal bank flagged your fraudulent loan application. You thought you could play games with my life. You thought I was a senile old fool waiting to die. I am not playing games, Julian. I am building a cage, and you are walking right into it. I turned back to the doctor, who was now visibly shaking. His cheap suit seemed to hang loosely on his trembling frame. If you sign that paper, I will personally ensure you spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary for participating in a wire fraud conspiracy. I told the doctor, my tone absolutely deadly. You will never practice medicine again. You will be ruined. Pick up your bag and walk out of this building right now, or I will shout for the orderly and have you arrested for trespassing and attempted medical fraud. Dr. Thorne did not hesitate for a single second. He looked at Julian with pure terror and absolute hatred. You told me he was a vegetable, the doctor hissed at my son. You told me this was easy money. You are insane. I am not going to federal prison for you. The doctor ripped the evaluation forms in half, tossing the pieces onto the floor. He grabbed his black leather medical bag and turned toward the exit. Julian reached out, trying to grab the doctor's arm, begging him to stay, begging him to just sign the paper. Dr. Thorne violently shoved Julian away. Keep your dirty money, the doctor shouted, terrified. Do not ever contact me again. The doctor practically ran out of the visitor lounge, pushing his way through the heavy glass doors and disappearing into the parking lot. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. A few elderly patients stared at us from across the room, but I ignored them. I kept my eyes locked on my son. Julian stood in the center of the room, completely alone. His chest heaved as he breathed heavily. The arrogant, successful tech entrepreneur facade was completely shattered. He looked like a frightened little boy who had just realized the monster under his bed was entirely real. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and profound confusion. He could not comprehend what had just happened. He had spent weeks convincing himself I was a broken, forgotten old man. He had dumped me in this miserable facility, believing I would quietly fade away. He never expected the old man to systematically dismantle his corrupt medical expert in under 3 minutes. You, Julian started, his voice shaking uncontrollably. You are not sick. You are faking it. You have been faking it this entire time. I slowly leaned back in the vinyl chair, allowing the cold, commanding smile to return to my face. I steepled my fingers, looking at my son with pure, unadulterated disappointment. I am exactly who I have always been, Julian, I said softly but firmly. I am the man who built an empire from nothing. I am the man who paid your debts and housed your arrogant wife. You thought you could throw my wife's memories into a dumpster and simply take my kingdom. You assumed my silence was weakness. You assumed my grief was a cognitive decline. You made a catastrophic miscalculation. Julian backed away from me, his hands shaking. He looked around the room as if expecting police officers to jump out from behind the curtains. What are you going to do? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I let out a low, dark chuckle. I am going to do what I do best, Julian. I am going to watch you try to build a life on a rotten foundation. And then I am going to watch the entire structure collapse on top of you. You have a bank loan waiting for medical clearance? A loan you cannot get now? You have an expensive renovation happening in a house you do not own. You are running out of time and you are running out of money. Julian turned pale. He realized I knew everything. He realized I knew about the bank loan, the renovation, and the forged deed. He stumbled backward, hitting the heavy glass doors. He did not say another word. He pushed the doors open and ran out into the humid Atlanta air, leaving me sitting peacefully in the vinyl chair. The trap was closing and Julian was suffocating. I returned to my narrow bed in the nursing home after Julian fled from the visitor lounge. The air in my room felt completely different now. It was no longer a place of waiting. It was a command center. I pulled my hidden burner phone from my heavy work boot and opened the encrypted surveillance application. The camera feeds from my Buckhead estate illuminated the dark screen. The visual before me was nothing short of a masterpiece of pure, unadulterated greed. Richard and Susan Sterling had practically moved into my house to oversee the massive renovation project. I watched the first camera feed located in the main living room. A small army of highly paid contractors was moving through the space carrying heavy materials and shouting instructions. The entire east wing of the ground floor had been completely gutted. The historic load-bearing wall that Julian had arrogantly ordered removed was gone, replaced by a massive hidden steel support beam that must have cost a fortune to install safely. Mr. Hernandez says hi. Watched Richard pacing back and forth across the dusty floor, pointing his finger at the construction foreman. My daughter is hosting a massive event here next week, and this foyer needs to be absolutely flawless. We are not paying you to make excuses. We are paying you to deliver perfection. Richard was completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality of his situation. He was standing in a house belonging to a blind corporate trust, holding invoices for a $300,000 renovation, funded entirely by his liquidated retirement savings. He thought he was securing a luxurious summer home and solidifying his generational wealth. He believed Julian had legally secured the property through that forged quit-claim deed. I switched the feed to the camera I had placed near the dining area overlooking the rear exterior of the property. The backyard had been transformed into a massive construction zone. The contractors were finishing the installation of a spectacular custom-built swimming pool. It featured a cascading waterfall design and dark slate tiles that sparkled in the afternoon sun. I had always wanted to put a pool in that exact spot, but Vivian always preferred having a large garden for her roses. Now Chloe and her parents had generously decided to build it for me using their own money. I switched the feed back to the main foyer. A team of specialized workers was carefully unboxing massive slabs of flawless imported Italian marble. Chloe walked into the frame holding a designer coffee cup, clapping her hands together in pure delight. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the expensive stone. "It is perfect," she squealed, looking at her father. "This is exactly the aesthetic we needed. It completely erases all that awful ghetto clutter the old man used to hoard in this space. Your mother and I drained every penny we had to make this happen, but seeing this house transformed makes it all worth it. You and Julian are going to rule Atlanta high society from this estate." I listened to their arrogant banter, feeling a deep, satisfying sense of poetic justice. They were upgrading the plumbing, they were modernizing the electrical grid. They were effectively increasing the market value of my property by hundreds of thousands of dollars. And because they were performing unauthorized renovations on a property they did not legally own, Georgia real estate law classified every single penny they spent as a permanent, unconditional gift to the legal property owner. While Chloe and her parents celebrated their perceived victory, Julian was quietly suffocating under the weight of his own crimes. I switched the camera feed to my home office. Julian sat at my antique oak desk, looking like a man standing on the edge of a sheer cliff. His face was pale and his hands trembled as he scrolled through his computer screens. He had returned to the house immediately after fleeing the nursing home. I watched him pour himself a massive glass of scotch from the wet bar, spilling some of the expensive amber liquid onto the glass desk. He swallowed the drink in one gulp, breathing heavily. He was completely trapped. He knew I was perfectly lucid. He knew I was fully aware of the forged deed, the stolen money, and the fraudulent bank loan. He also knew he could not tell his wife or his in-laws the truth. If he told Chloe that the deed was worthless and that I was planning to destroy them, she would panic. If he told Richard and Susan that they had just poured their entire $300,000 retirement fund into a house he did not actually own, they would likely kill him themselves. Julian had to maintain the illusion of success. He had to pretend the federal bank loan was still coming. He had to pretend the house was legally secured. He picked up his phone and dialed a number, putting it on speaker. It was the Federal Bank in New York. Julian begged the customer service representative to bypass the medical clearance requirement, pleading that his startup needed the $500,000 wire transfer immediately to cover payroll and event costs. The representative calmly informed him that the compliance check was mandatory and the funds could not be released without the proper medical documentation regarding the property transfer. He buried his face in his hands, weeping quietly in the empty office. He was nothing but a complete failure and a thief, and the walls were rapidly closing in around him. Despite Julian suffocating in secret, the superficial machinery of Chloe and her high society ambitions continued to operate at full speed. 2 days later, I sat in the nursing home dining hall, forcing down a bowl of flavorless oatmeal. I pulled out my burner phone and opened a fake social media account I had created to monitor my daughter-in-law. Chloe had just posted a highly produced professional video announcement. I tapped the screen to play the video, keeping the volume low. Chloe stood in the center of my newly renovated foyer wearing a stunning designer gown. The imported Italian marble gleamed beneath her feet. The custom pool sparkled through the massive new bay windows behind her. "Welcome to the new era," she announced to the camera, her voice dripping with artificial charm and intense arrogance. "Julian and I are absolutely thrilled to officially unveil our newly fully renovated historic Buckhead estate. But that is not all. We are combining our home unveiling with the official launch of Julian's revolutionary new tech startup." The video cut to a montage of catered food, expensive champagne, and aerial drone footage of my property. Chloe reappeared holding a crystal glass, smiling directly into the camera lens. "We are hosting the most exclusive event of the season this coming Saturday night," she declared. "We have invited 150 of the most influential people in Atlanta. We have venture capitalists, angel investors, local politicians, and high society elite, all confirmed to attend. It is going to be a night of luxury, innovation, and absolute perfection. You will not want to miss the beginning of our new empire." The video ended with a sleek graphic displaying the date and time of the massive party. I locked the screen of my burner phone and slid it back into my pocket. My heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm. Chloe was not just throwing a party. She was assembling an audience. She was gathering 150 of the most important, wealthy, and influential people in the city to witness the grand debut of her stolen life. She invited investors who believed Julian was a genius. She invited politicians who believed they were a prominent, successful couple. She invited the exact people Julian needed to impress to save his failing company. It was the perfect stage. It was the most visible public platform they could possibly construct. They wanted a grand unveiling. They wanted the entire city to watch them ascend to the throne. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to let them put on their beautiful clothes. I was going to let them pour the expensive champagne. I was going to let them fill my house with the most powerful people in Atlanta. And then I was going to walk through the front doors of my own home and execute the most devastating public demolition this city had ever seen. The masterpiece of their greed was fully built. The guest list was set. The stage was prepared. It was finally time for the architect to return home and bring the entire structure crashing down on their heads. I would personally make sure they lost absolutely everything they held dear. They treated me like a burden and threw my beloved wife into the trash. Now I was going to throw them into a very cold, dark federal prison cell. My own son handed me a single black trash bag containing my clothes and told me I no longer fit the aesthetic of my own home. His wife stood on the porch of the multi-million-dollar Atlanta estate I paid for, complaining about the ghetto clutter she had just tossed into an industrial dumpster. That clutter was my late wife Vivian's entire legacy. They pointed me to a rundown state facility and told me to disappear. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply turned around and walked away. But what those two fools did not realize was that a retired structural engineer knows exactly which load-bearing walls to knock out to make a house collapse. Before I tell you how I tore their perfect lives down to the foundation, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your parents should always come with a devastating price. My name is Clifford Henderson and I am 74 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer building commercial high-rises across the country while quietly investing every spare dollar into real estate. Vivian and I built a quiet, beautiful life together. We did not flaunt our wealth. We wore simple clothes, drove reliable cars, and poured our love into our only son, Julian. When Vivian passed away suddenly last year, my world went completely dark. The quiet of our massive historic brick estate in Buckhead, Atlanta, became suffocating. So when Julian asked to move in temporarily with his new wife, Chloe, I made the biggest mistake a grieving father could make. I said yes. I thought having family close would heal the void in my chest. I thought Julian, who was struggling to get his tech startup off the ground, needed his father. I was wrong. They did not want a father. They wanted a free luxury hotel and an ATM. The true nightmare began on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. I was returning home from a routine checkup with my cardiologist. The car pulled up to my long circular driveway, and my heart instantly dropped into my stomach. Sitting right on the curb crushing the manicured grass Vivian used to meticulously care for was a massive, rusted industrial dumpster. I stepped out of the car, my knees feeling heavy. I walked toward the steel bin and looked over the edge. What I saw inside made my breath catch in my throat. It was not old furniture or construction debris. It was Vivian. There, buried under discarded cardboard boxes and empty iced coffee cups, was her vintage Singer sewing machine, the one she used to mend Julian's torn jeans when he was a little boy. Next to it were her favorite floral dresses, the ones that still faintly smelled of her signature lavender perfume. And scattered across the top like meaningless trash were our family photo albums. Decades of memories, vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, just tossed away like garbage. I reached in with trembling hands and pulled out one of the heavy leather-bound albums, brushing the dirt off the cover. My chest tightened with an agonizing grief that quickly morphed into something entirely different. A cold, hard rage began to freeze the blood in my veins. I turned toward the house. Standing on the expansive wraparound porch were Julian and Chloe. Chloe was wearing expensive designer athletic wear, holding a green matcha latte, looking at her phone. Julian stood beside her, wearing a crisp, tailored suit, looking every bit the successful tech CEO he pretended to be. I walked up the stone steps, my face a blank mask. "What is the meaning of this, Julian?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Chloe rolled her eyes and took a sip of her drink before Julian could even speak. "Oh my God, Clifford, please do not make a scene." She sighed in that condescending, high-pitched tone she always used with me. "We are remodeling the entire ground floor. This house is a historic gem, but the interior was completely ruining our vibe. We had to purge all that old ghetto clutter. It was frankly embarrassing to have our investors over with all those dusty doilies and ancient junk everywhere." Ghetto clutter. She was referring to African artifacts Vivian and I had imported from Ghana. She was referring to hand-carved mahogany tables and family heirlooms that told the story of our ancestry. I looked at my son, expecting him to defend his mother's memory. Instead, Julian just adjusted his expensive watch and looked me dead in the eye with a chilling corporate coldness. "Chloe is right, Dad," Julian said without a trace of emotion. "We are hosting a massive launch party for my startup next month. We need the space to reflect success and innovation. You living here shuffling around looking sad all the time, it just does not fit the aesthetic we are going for anymore. You are holding us back." Holding them back. I paid the property taxes. I paid the utility bills. I had even paid off Julian's massive credit card debts twice in the last 5 years. Julian reached behind the porch pillar and pulled out a single black plastic trash bag. He dropped it at my feet. It landed with a pathetic thud. "I packed your essentials," he said, handing me a folded piece of paper. "This is the address to the Pine Haven Care Facility. It is a state-run home, but it is perfectly adequate for your needs. I already paid for the first month. The car I called for you should be here any minute. You need to be around people your own age, Dad. You need medical supervision." Medical supervision. My mind raced. I was 74, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. My doctor had just told me I had the heart of a 50-year-old man. They were not sending me away for my health. They were discarding me because I was an inconvenience to their high society masquerade. A normal man would have screamed. A normal father would have slapped his son across the face, demanded respect, and ordered them off his property. But I am not a normal man. I spent my entire career calculating stress points, figuring out exactly how much weight a structure can take before it collapses. I looked at Julian and Chloe standing there on my porch, dripping with unearned arrogance, and I realized something vital. If I fought them now, they would just call the police, claim I was having a senile episode, and make my life miserable. If I kicked them out today, they would just move to another apartment and continue their pathetic facade of a life. That was not enough. They had thrown my wife's soul into a dumpster. They needed to lose everything. I looked at Julian's smug face and then at Chloe, who was already scrolling through her phone again, completely unbothered by the fact that she was tearing a family apart. I did not say a single word. I did not shed a single tear. I bent down slowly, ignoring the ache in my knees, and picked up the black trash bag containing a few of my shirts and pants. I clutched Vivian's photo album tightly under my left arm. I turned my back on my own son and walked down the long driveway toward the waiting car. I could feel their eyes on my back, likely celebrating their easy victory. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was too weak, too broken by grief to fight back. As I got into the back seat of the car, I looked out the window at the beautiful brick estate I had purchased decades ago. I watched Julian put his arm around Chloe, laughing about something as they walked back inside my house. The morning of the massive high society party arrived with a thick, humid heat settling over Atlanta. I woke up on the stiff mattress of the Pine Haven Care Facility for the very last time. I did not put on the faded oversized cardigan Julian had packed for me in that black trash bag. I packed my hidden recording device and my burner phone. I walked out of my cramped room and marched straight down the pale green hallway toward the main reception desk. I did not shuffle my feet. I did not let my jaw hang slack. I walked with the heavy, measured steps of a man who spent 40 years commanding construction sites and dominating boardrooms. The tired receptionist was sipping her morning coffee when I approached the scratched fiberglass counter. I looked her dead in the eye and spoke with absolute clarity. "I am checking myself out of this facility immediately," I told her. "Print the discharge papers right now." The receptionist nearly dropped her coffee mug. She stared at me, completely stunned by the sudden transformation. "Sir, you cannot just leave," she stammered, reaching for her telephone. "Your son Julian has medical power of attorney. He placed you here for severe cognitive decline." I placed my hands flat on the counter, leaning forward until she shrank back in her chair. "My son has absolutely zero legal authority over my life," I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet lobby. "I submitted to this facility voluntarily. If you look at my intake forms, you will see I signed myself in. And under Georgia state law, I have the absolute right to sign myself out at any given moment. If you attempt to hold me in this building against my will for even one more minute, I will have my attorney file a massive lawsuit against this facility for unlawful imprisonment. Print the papers." She typed frantically on her keyboard, her hands shaking. 5 minutes later, I signed the official discharge documents with a sharp, precise signature. The heavy glass doors of the facility slid open. I walked out into the bright morning sun, leaving the smell of bleach and boiled cabbage behind me forever. A sleek black town car was already idling at the curb. I opened the rear door and slid into the cool leather interior. The driver nodded at me, pulling away from the miserable cinderblock building. I was no longer the forgotten old man waiting to die. I was the architect of my own justice. The town car drove away from the neglected outskirts of the city and headed directly toward the most exclusive luxury shopping district in Atlanta. I had a party to attend tonight, and I refused to walk into my own home looking like a victim. The driver pulled up to the storefront of a prestigious bespoke tailor I had used for decades. The bell above the door chimed as I walked inside. The shop smelled of rich wool and expensive leather. The master tailor, an older Italian man named Vincenzo, looked up from his cutting table. His eyes widened in surprise. "Clifford," he said warmly, walking over to shake my hand. "It has been over a year since I saw you last. We were terribly sorry to hear about Vivian." I thanked him graciously, but I did not have time for pleasantries. "Vincenzo, I need a suit," I told him. "I need your finest material, and I need it tailored perfectly by 5 o'clock this evening. Money is absolutely no object." Vincenzo smiled, pulling out his measuring tape. He guided me to the premium fabric selection. I chose a dark charcoal gray wool blend that felt like liquid silk. It was powerful, intimidating, and completely flawless. For the next 3 hours, Vincenzo and his team worked frantically, adjusting the seams, measuring the cuffs, and ensuring the fit was completely immaculate. I purchased a crisp white Egyptian cotton shirt, a deep crimson silk tie, and a pair of polished black leather Oxfords. The entire purchase cost over $3,000. I handed Vincenzo my heavy metal corporate card without a single hesitation. When I finally stepped in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, I did not see the grieving widower Julian had thrown into a dumpster. I saw the multi-millionaire structural engineer who built an empire from the ground up. I looked like a man who owned the room before he even stepped inside. I adjusted my crimson tie and thanked Vincenzo. I walked out of the tailor shop radiating pure, absolute authority. The town car transported me to a private, secure location downtown. I walked into the private lounge of an exclusive business club where my attorney Renee was waiting for me. She sat at a secluded corner table sipping a glass of sparkling water. A heavy black leather briefcase rested on the polished wooden table in front of her. When she saw me approach, she smiled a predatory, wicked smile. "You look like a man ready to execute a hostile takeover, Clifford," she said, gesturing for me to sit down. I took my seat, buttoning my charcoal gray jacket. "I am not taking over Renee," I replied smoothly. "I am simply reclaiming what has always been mine. Tell me you have the ammunition." Renee unclasped the brass locks of the heavy leather briefcase. The sharp click echoed in the quiet lounge. She opened the lid, turning it toward me. Inside were neatly organized stacks of pristine legal documents. Every single paper was a lethal weapon designed to completely obliterate Julie and Chloe and her arrogant parents. Renee pulled out the first thick stack of papers bound in a blue legal folder. These are the certified, undeniable trust documents, Renee explained, placing them in front of me. These papers prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that Vanguard Holdings fully owns the Buckhead estate. It contains the original deeds, the blind trust registration from Delaware, and the irrefutable proof that you are the sole controlling beneficiary. When you show these documents to the crowd tonight, Julian will not be able to argue. His forged quitclaim deed will instantly become a worthless piece of garbage in front of his precious investors. I nodded, running my hand over the blue folder. I moved my eyes to the next document. Renee pulled out a sealed manila envelope stamped with the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Agent Miller delivered this personally an hour ago," she whispered, her voice buzzing with excitement. "These are the active federal arrest warrants for your son. He is being charged with interstate wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit forgery. Chloe is listed as a co-conspirator. The federal agents are already in position around your neighborhood in unmarked vehicles. They are waiting for your exact signal to breach the front doors of the estate." I felt a cold, satisfying thrill wash over my chest. Julian thought he was untouchable, hosting a massive party celebrating his fake success. He was completely unaware that heavily armed federal agents were drinking coffee in vehicles just down the street, waiting to drag him away in handcuffs. "What about the bank loan?" I asked, looking back at the briefcase. Renee pulled out a single sheet of paper featuring the letterhead of the Federal Bank in New York. "This is the official wire transfer confirmation," Renee stated, tapping the paper with her perfectly manicured fingernail. "The bank released the $500,000 exactly as we instructed. The funds crossed state lines and successfully landed in Julian's corporate startup account at 9:00 this morning. He literally spent $50,000 of stolen bank money today paying the caterers, the decorators, and the valet services for his party tonight. His federal crime is fully completed and documented. There is no turning back for him now. He is completely trapped." I looked at the final stack of papers resting at the bottom of the leather briefcase. These were the documents I was most looking forward to delivering. Renee pulled them out, placing them carefully on the table. "These are the immediate eviction notices signed by a state judge," Renee explained. "Because Richard and Susan Sterling do not possess a valid lease, and because they performed unauthorized renovations on a property belonging to a corporate trust, they are legally classified as hostile squatters. You have the absolute legal right to remove them from the premises immediately without a 30-day notice. Once the federal agents arrest Julian and Chloe, you can hand these notices directly to Richard and Susan. They will have exactly 10 minutes to gather their belongings and vacate the property, or the local police will arrest them for criminal trespassing." I stared at the eviction notices, picturing the look of absolute horror that would soon cover Susan and Richard's faces. They had liquidated their entire $300,000 retirement fund to install custom imported Italian marble and a beautiful cascading swimming pool in my backyard. They believed they owned half of my $3 million estate. They mocked the African artifacts Vivian and I had cherished, throwing them in the trash like common garbage. Tonight they would walk out the front door with nothing but the clothes on their backs, leaving their entire life savings cemented into the foundation of a house they would never step foot inside again. "Everything is perfectly aligned," Clifford Renee said, closing the empty briefcase. "The guest list is packed. The investors are drinking champagne. The politicians are shaking hands. Julian and Chloe are currently standing in your living room believing they are the king and queen of Atlanta high society. The storm is fully prepared." I stood up, picking up the stack of lethal legal documents. I slid the trust papers, the wire fraud confirmation, the federal warrants, and the eviction notices into the interior pockets of my bespoke charcoal gray suit. The weight of the paper felt perfect against my chest. I looked at Renee, giving her a brief acknowledging nod. I walked out of the private club and stepped into the humid evening air. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the city streets. The town car was waiting to drive me back to Buckhead. The calm was officially over. It was time to unleash the hurricane. My own son handed me a single black trash bag containing my clothes and told me I no longer fit the aesthetic of my own home. His wife stood on the porch of the multi-million-dollar Atlanta estate I paid for, complaining about the ghetto clutter she had just tossed into an industrial dumpster. That clutter was my late wife Vivian's entire legacy. They pointed me to a run-down state facility and told me to disappear. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply turned around and walked away. But what those two fools did not realize was that a retired structural engineer knows exactly which load-bearing walls to knock out to make a house collapse. Before I tell you how I tore their perfect lives down to the foundation, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your parents should always come with a devastating price. My name is Clifford Henderson, and I am 74 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer, building commercial high-rises across the country while quietly investing every spare dollar into real estate. Vivian and I built a quiet, beautiful life together. We did not flaunt our wealth. We wore simple clothes, drove reliable cars, and poured our love into our only son, Julian. When Vivian passed away suddenly last year, my world went completely dark. The quiet of our massive, historic brick estate in Buckhead, Atlanta, became suffocating. So when Julian asked to move in temporarily with his new wife, Chloe, I made the biggest mistake a grieving father could make. I said yes. I thought having family close would heal the void in my chest. I thought Julian, who was struggling to get his tech startup off the ground, needed his father. I was wrong. They did not want a father. They wanted a free, luxury hotel and an ATM. The true nightmare began on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. I was returning home from a routine checkup with my cardiologist. The car pulled up to my long, circular driveway, and my heart instantly dropped into my stomach. Sitting right on the curb, crushing the manicured grass Vivian used to meticulously care for, was a massive, rusted industrial dumpster. I stepped out of the car, my knees feeling heavy. I walked toward the steel bin and looked over the edge. What I saw inside made my breath catch in my throat. It was not old furniture or construction debris. It was Vivian. There, buried under discarded cardboard boxes and empty iced coffee cups, was her vintage Singer sewing machine, the one she used to mend Julian's torn jeans when he was a little boy. Next to it were her favorite floral dresses, the ones that still faintly smelled of her signature lavender perfume. And scattered across the top like meaningless trash were our family photo albums. Decades of memories, vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, just tossed away like garbage. I reached in with trembling hands and pulled out one of the heavy leather-bound albums, brushing the dirt off the cover. My chest tightened with an agonizing grief that quickly morphed into something entirely different. A cold, hard rage began to freeze the blood in my veins. I turned toward the house. Standing on the expansive wraparound porch were Julian and Chloe. Chloe was wearing expensive designer athletic wear, holding a green matcha latte, looking at her phone. Julian stood beside her, wearing a crisp, tailored suit, looking every bit the successful tech CEO he pretended to be. I walked up the stone steps, my face a blank mask. "What is the meaning of this, Julian?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Chloe rolled her eyes and took a sip of her drink before Julian could even speak. "Oh my God. Clifford, please do not make a scene." She sighed in that condescending, high-pitched tone she always used with me. "We are remodeling the entire ground floor. This house is a historic gem, but the interior was completely ruining our vibe. We had to purge all that old ghetto clutter. It was frankly embarrassing to have our investors over with all those dusty doilies and ancient junk everywhere." Ghetto clutter. She was referring to African artifacts Vivian and I had imported from Ghana. She was referring to hand-carved mahogany tables and family heirlooms that told the story of our ancestry. I looked at my son, expecting him to defend his mother's memory. Instead, Julian just adjusted his expensive watch and looked me dead in the eye with a chilling corporate coldness. "Chloe is right, Dad," Julian said without a trace of emotion. "We are hosting a massive launch party for my startup next month. We need the space to reflect success and innovation. You living here, shuffling around, looking sad all the time, it just does not fit the aesthetic we are going for anymore. You are holding us back, holding them back. I paid the property taxes, I paid the utility bills, I had even paid off Julian's massive credit card debts twice in the last 5 years." Julian reached behind the porch pillar and pulled out a single black plastic trash bag. He dropped it at my feet. It landed with a pathetic thud. "I packed your essentials," he said, handing me a folded piece of paper. "This is the address to the Pine Haven Care Facility. It is a state-run home, but it is perfectly adequate for your needs. I already paid for the first month. The car I called for you should be here any minute. You need to be around people your own age, Dad. You need medical supervision." Medical supervision. My mind raced. I was 74, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. My doctor had just told me I had the heart of a 50-year-old man. They were not sending me away for my health. They were discarding me because I was an inconvenience to their high society masquerade. A normal man would have screamed. A normal father would have slapped his son across the face, demanded respect, and ordered them off his property. But I am not a normal man. I spent my entire career calculating stress points, figuring out exactly how much weight a structure can take before it collapses. I looked at Julian and Chloe standing there on my porch, dripping with unearned arrogance, and I realized something vital. If I fought them now, they would just call the police, claim I was having a senile episode, and make my life miserable. If I kicked them out today, they would just move to another apartment and continue their pathetic facade of a life. That was not enough. They had thrown my wife's soul into a dumpster. They needed to lose everything. I looked at Julian's smug face, and then at Chloe, who was already scrolling through her phone again, completely unbothered by the fact that she was tearing a family apart. I did not say a single word. I did not shed a single tear. I bent down slowly, ignoring the ache in my knees, and picked up the black trash bag containing a few of my shirts and pants. I clutched Vivian's photo album tightly under my left arm. I turned my back on my own son and walked down the long driveway toward the waiting car. I could feel their eyes on my back, likely celebrating their easy victory. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was too weak, too broken by grief to fight back. As I got into the back seat of the car, I looked out the window at the beautiful brick estate I had purchased decades ago. I watched Julian put his arm around Chloe, laughing about something, as they walked back inside my house. The heavy black town car turned onto my street in Buckhead. The quiet residential road I had lived on for decades was completely transformed. Julian and Chloe had turned the entire neighborhood into a chaotic spectacle. Expensive luxury vehicles lined both sides of the street, reflecting the glow of the antique street lamps. Valet drivers in crisp white shirts and black vests ran back and forth, juggling keys and opening doors for the high society elite of Atlanta. I could hear the faint sound of a classical string quartet playing from the backyard, floating over the high brick walls. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted catering. They were throwing the party of the decade, using stolen money and a forged deed to fund their grand illusion. I tapped the leather armrest, telling my driver to pull directly up to the main gates. The car stopped right at the base of my long, circular driveway. A young valet worker rushed over, pulling open my door with a practiced, professional smile. He expected a wealthy investor or a local politician to step out. Instead, he saw an imposing 74-year-old African-American man wearing a $3,000 bespoke charcoal gray suit. I stepped out of the vehicle, planting my polished black leather Oxfords firmly onto the pavement. The valet looked confused. He held up his hand, asking for my name on the guest list. He told me the event was strictly invitation only, and that no uninvited guests were allowed past the front gates. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. I folded the bill once and pressed it directly into the palm of his hand. I looked him dead in the eye, telling him I owned the concrete he was standing on. The young man swallowed hard, looking at the money and then looking at my face. He recognized the absolute authority radiating from my posture. He quickly stepped aside, lowering his head and allowing me to pass without another word. I walked up the long, sweeping driveway. The landscaping had been completely altered. The beautiful rose bushes Vivian had planted with her own hands were gone, replaced by sterile, modern geometric hedges, illuminated by harsh white ground lights. The entire exterior of my home felt cold and unfamiliar, but the foundation remained exactly as I had built it decades ago. I reached the massive double front doors. They were propped wide open, welcoming the elite guests into the newly renovated interior. I stepped across the threshold and entered the grand foyer. The space was completely unrecognizable. The rich mahogany floors had been ripped out and replaced by glaring, white imported Italian marble. Modern abstract art hung on the walls where my beautiful African artifacts used to be. Waiters in black uniforms circulated through the massive crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and expensive hors d'oeuvres. The room was packed with over 150 people. I recognized several powerful venture capitalists, local politicians, and prominent business leaders mingling and laughing. Julian had truly gathered the most influential people in the city to witness his grand unveiling. He wanted an audience for his coronation, but he had inadvertently assembled an audience for his execution. I moved through the crowded foyer, walking with deliberate, measured steps. Nobody paid any attention to the older man in the tailored suit. They assumed I was just another wealthy investor or perhaps a retired politician invited to celebrate the new tech startup. I kept my face completely neutral, observing the absolute absurdity of the event. I saw Chloe's parents, Richard and Susan Sterling, standing near the grand staircase. Susan was wearing an obnoxiously bright designer gown, holding a glass of champagne, gesturing wildly as she spoke to a group of sophisticated investors. I stood near a massive marble pillar, listening to her boast. She loudly claimed that she and Richard had personally funded the entire renovation of this historic estate. She bragged about the custom swimming pool and the imported stone, telling the guests that they planned to use the house as their private summer retreat. She soaked up the admiring glances of the crowd, completely unaware that she had liquidated her entire life savings into a house she would never legally own. Richard stood proudly beside her, nodding along, playing the role of the wealthy benefactor. They were completely intoxicated by their own lies. I continued walking toward the main living room. The string quartet played a lively classical piece, masking the sound of my heavy footsteps on the marble floor. That was when I finally spotted her. Chloe was standing near the center of the room, holding court. She wore a stunning backless silver gown that caught the light with every movement. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she wore diamonds that likely cost more than a luxury car. She was laughing, throwing her head back, performing the role of the ultimate high society hostess. She looked like a queen ruling over her newly conquered kingdom. Then she turned her head. Her eyes swept across the crowd and locked directly onto me. The beautiful fake smile completely vanished from her face. Her jaw dropped slightly and her eyes widened in absolute shock. For a fraction of a second, she looked like she had seen a ghost. She expected me to be rotting in a filthy room at the Pine Haven Care Facility, wearing faded clothes and drooling on myself. She never expected Clifford Henderson to walk into her elite party wearing a bespoke suit, looking powerful and completely lucid. The shock quickly morphed into pure, unadulterated fury. Her face turned bright red, clashing horribly with her silver gown. She excused herself from the group of wealthy investors and marched directly toward me. Her high heels clicked aggressively against the marble floor. She stopped just inches away from my chest, glaring up at me with eyes full of venom. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice a harsh whisper designed to avoid attracting the attention of her wealthy guests. "Who let you out of that facility, Clifford? You are supposed to be locked in your room. You are completely ruining my aesthetic. Look at you standing here like you belong. This is an exclusive launch party for successful people, not a charity event for confused old men." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, calculating pity. I did not respond to her insults. I did not defend myself. I simply stared at her, letting the silence stretch until she became visibly uncomfortable. She crossed her arms, her breathing heavy with anger. "I am calling security right now," Chloe threatened, pulling her sleek smartphone from her silver clutch purse. "You are having a senile episode and you wandered away from your facility. I will have you forcibly removed from my property. You are a vagrant, Clifford. You are a pathetic old vagrant trespassing in my home." "Security," she hissed loudly, waving her hand toward two large men in black suits standing near the hallway. "Remove this vagrant immediately. He is disturbing my guests." The two security guards began to walk toward us, but they never reached my side. I had anticipated this exact scenario. Before the guards could even take 5 steps, 2 massive men wearing dark suits stepped out from the crowd and intercepted them. These were not random guests. They were highly trained off-duty police officers I had hired privately earlier that afternoon. They flashed their official badges to Chloe's rented security team, speaking to them in low, authoritative voices. The security guards immediately backed away, recognizing the legal authority of my hired protection. Chloe watched her guards retreat, her expression shifting from fury to deep, profound confusion. She looked back at me, her confidence beginning to crack. "What is going on?" "Clifford," she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. "Who are those men? Why are they here?" I did not answer her. I simply stepped around her, walking purposefully toward the massive glass doors leading to the backyard where the music was playing. The time for private conversations was over. It was time to pull the curtain down on this pathetic theater production. I walked past the imported marble columns and stepped out onto the custom patio overlooking the cascading swimming pool Richard and Susan had paid for. The backyard was filled with dozens of influential people drinking and dancing. The string quartet was set up on a raised wooden platform. while a professional disc jockey stood behind a massive sound system mixing ambient electronic music for the younger crowd. I walked directly toward the disc jockey booth. The young man wearing massive headphones did not notice me approaching until I was standing right beside him. I reached over his electronic soundboard, grabbing the main power cable connecting the entire audio system to the outdoor speakers. I did not ask for permission. I gripped the thick black cord and ripped it violently out of the power socket. The ambient music died instantly. The sudden crushing silence washed over the massive backyard. Conversation stopped abruptly. Hundreds of guests turned their heads, looking toward the raised platform in utter confusion. The string quartet lowered their instruments, unsure of what was happening. The clinking of crystal champagne glasses ceased. 150 of the most powerful people in Atlanta stood completely frozen, staring at the 74-year-old man standing behind the audio equipment. I reached across the soundboard and picked up the wireless microphone. I turned it on, tapping the metal mesh head twice. The sharp thud echoed loudly through the silent backyard, demanding the absolute attention of every single person present. I stood tall, smoothing the lapels of my charcoal gray suit. I looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, local politicians, and arrogant socialites. I spotted Julian standing near the edge of the new swimming pool holding a glass of scotch. He was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked like a man who just realized his parachute was packed with bricks. "Welcome to my home," I announced, my voice booming through the outdoor speakers, deep and resonant and completely devoid of any weakness. The crowd murmured in confusion. They looked at Julian and Chloe, who had promoted this event as their own grand estate unveiling. Julian dropped his glass of scotch. It shattered against the slate tiles, spilling expensive liquor into the custom pool. He panicked completely. He lunged forward, sprinting toward the raised platform, desperate to stop me from speaking. Dad shut the microphone off. Julian screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "He is confused, everyone. My father is suffering from severe dementia. Please, someone help me get him off the stage." Julian tried to rush up the wooden steps, but my two hired off-duty police officers moved with lightning speed. They stepped directly into Julian's path, forming an impenetrable human wall. Julian slammed into them, but they did not budge an inch. One of the officers placed a heavy hand firmly on Julian's chest, shoving him backward down the stairs. "Stay back, sir," the officer commanded, his voice echoing across the silent yard. "Let the man speak." Julian stumbled backward, looking around desperately. Chloe ran to his side, grabbing his arm, her face pale with shock. The guests watched the physical altercation in absolute silence, realizing this was not a confused old man wandering onto a stage. This was a deliberate, calculated, hostile takeover occurring right in front of their eyes. I looked down at my son, watching him tremble. I reached into the interior pocket of my bespoke jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the fraudulent quit-claim deed Julian had filed with the county clerk. I unfolded the document, holding it high in the air for the entire crowd of investors and politicians to see. "Julian told all of you that he owns this magnificent historic estate," I said, speaking slowly and deliberately, ensuring every word carried the weight of absolute truth. "He told you he was a successful tech entrepreneur capable of hosting lavish events in his newly renovated mansion. He lied to you. He lied to every single person standing in this yard today." The murmur of the crowd grew louder. I saw several prominent venture capitalists narrow their eyes, looking suspiciously at Julian. "My son does not own this house." I continued, my voice cutting through the whispers like a serrated blade. "He does not own the Italian marble beneath your feet, and he does not own the custom pool behind you. In fact, my son is completely and utterly bankrupt. He drained my personal checking account, stealing $40,000 just to buy himself some time. And when that was not enough, he decided to steal my entire property." I waved the paper in the air. "This document I am holding is a quitclaim deed filed with the county clerk just a few weeks ago. It transfers the entire ownership of this $3 million estate directly into the names of Julian and Chloe Henderson. There is only one minor problem with this document. The signature at the bottom is a complete forgery. My son forged my name and paid off a corrupt notary to steal my home while I was grieving the death of my beautiful wife, Vivian." Julian fell to his knees, covering his face with his hands. Chloe let out a piercing shriek, shaking her head violently. "No," she screamed, looking at the wealthy guests surrounding her. "He is lying. He is a crazy old man. Julian owns this house. We own this house. We paid for the renovations. I turned my gaze toward Chloe and her parents, Richard and Susan, who were standing frozen near the patio doors. You paid for nothing, Chloe, I stated coldly. Your arrogant parents, Richard and Susan Sterling, liquidated their entire $300,000 retirement fund to pay for the imported marble and the cascading pool. They handed their life savings to my son, believing they were purchasing half of a luxury summer retreat. But they were conned by their own son-in-law. They poured their money into a house they will never legally own. Under Georgia real estate law, any unauthorized renovations performed on a property are legally classified as a permanent, unconditional gift to the property owner. So I would like to personally thank Richard and Susan for upgrading my backyard free of charge. Susan let out a horrific gasping sound, clutching her chest. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the expensive slate tiles, fainting completely. Richard dropped to the ground beside her, slapping her cheeks, screaming for someone to call a doctor. The high society crowd stepped away from them, treating them like diseased animals. But the forged deed is not even the best part of this story. I continued refusing to let the crowd look away from the stage. I reached into my jacket again, pulling out a heavy blue legal folder. You see, my son is not just a thief. He is an incredibly stupid thief. He forged a deed transferring ownership of a house that I do not even legally own. I opened the blue folder, revealing the official corporate seals. 15 years ago, my late wife and I placed this entire estate into an impenetrable blind corporate trust registered in Delaware. Vanguard Holdings fully owns this property. I am merely the controlling beneficiary. Julian forged a deed attempting to transfer a house from a man who has not owned it for over a decade. The document he filed is legally void and completely worthless. The venture capitalists in the crowd began to whisper frantically among themselves. They were realizing the massive implications of my words. If Julian did not own the house, his entire financial standing was a complete illusion. But Julian did not stop at local real estate fraud, I said, leaning closer to the microphone, my voice dropping to a dangerous register. He took that forged deed and he submitted it across state lines to a federal bank in New York. He used this stolen property as collateral to secure a $500,000 line of credit to fund the very tech startup you are all here celebrating tonight. That $500,000 crossed state lines and landed in his corporate account yesterday morning. He used that stolen federal bank money to pay for the champagne you are drinking and the catering you are eating. I reached into my pocket one last time, pulling out my burner phone. I pressed a single button, holding the phone up to the microphone. The audio recording I captured in the home office echoed across the silent backyard. Julian's desperate voice filled the air clear as day. I need this $500,000 transferred into our corporate accounts immediately to cover payroll. The house is fully mine. There are no other claims on the deed. Send the money as soon as the compliance check clears. The recording stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. My son committed interstate wire fraud and federal bank fraud, I announced, placing the phone back into my pocket. He built his startup on stolen money and forged documents. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and devastating. The wealthy investors did not hesitate. They pulled out their smartphones, dialing their corporate lawyers and wealth managers. They began marching toward the front doors, abandoning their champagne glasses on the tables. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a man facing decades in federal prison. Julian's career, his reputation, and his future were vaporized in less than 3 minutes. He knelt on the slate tiles, sobbing uncontrollably, watching his entire empire crumble into dust. I stood on the raised platform, looking down at the destruction I had orchestrated. I did not feel any regret. I did not feel any sorrow. They threw my wife's memories into a rusted dumpster and told me I was useless. I promised to tear their perfect lives down to the foundation, and I delivered on that promise flawlessly. Suddenly, the wailing sound of heavy sirens pierced the quiet evening air. The flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers illuminated the front of the estate, casting eerie shadows through the large bay windows. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrived. The final load-bearing wall was about to be completely demolished. I lowered the microphone, stepping down from the wooden platform. The guests parted like the Red Sea, allowing me to walk through the crowd completely unbothered. I had delivered the lesson. It was time to let the federal agents clean up the debris. Let me know in the comments below if you think Julian and Chloe deserve the federal prison sentences they received. Hit like and subscribe for more stories about why you should never underestimate the quiet strength of a grieving father. Blood may make you related, but it is loyalty and respect that make you family. I spent my life building an empire to hand down to my son, only to realize that inherited wealth without inherited character breeds nothing but monsters. Greed is a blinding poison. It convinces fools that kindness is a weakness to be exploited. But an old tree has deep roots. When you try to cut down the people who nurtured you, do not be surprised when the branches fall and crush you. Protect your peace guard, your legacy, and never let anyone steal your dignity. The silence that gripped the backyard of my estate was heavier than concrete. 150 of the most wealthy and influential people in Atlanta stood completely frozen, staring at the stage. The ambient electronic music was dead. The string quartet had lowered their instruments. The only sound left in the humid evening air was the soft splashing of the cascading waterfall flowing into the brand-new custom swimming pool. That pool was the exact symbol of the profound, arrogant greed that had infected my son and his wife. Julian remained on his knees on the expensive slate tiles, holding his head in his hands. He was physically present, but his mind had completely shattered. He knew his entire tech empire was built on stolen federal funds and a forged signature. He knew the sirens wailing in the distance were coming for him. Chloe stood a few feet away from him, her silver designer gown catching the harsh security lights. Her face was a mask of absolute terror and denial. She looked at the wealthy venture capitalists and prominent politicians who were already whispering to their lawyers and inching toward the exits. She was watching her high society dreams evaporate into thin air. But the absolute best part of the evening was just beginning to unfold. The crowd near the patio doors suddenly parted. Richard and Susan Sterling, Chloe's incredibly arrogant parents, pushed their way to the front of the gathering. Susan was clutching her tiny lapdog in one hand and her sparkling designer purse in the other. Her face was flushed with anger and confusion. Richard marched right behind her, his face twisted into a scowl of pure entitlement. They had spent the entire evening boasting to everyone who would listen about how they had personally funded the massive renovation of this historic Buckhead estate. They had strutted around my home acting like conquering royalty, telling the elite guests that they were going to use this multi-million-dollar property as their private summer retreat. Now they were looking at me standing on the raised wooden platform, holding a microphone and a stack of lethal legal documents. Richard did not understand the federal wire fraud I had just exposed. His mind was entirely focused on his own wallet. He stopped at the edge of the stage, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. "What on earth is going on here?" Richard demanded, his voice loud and cracking with panic. "What are you talking about, Clifford? Julian owns this house. He showed us the paperwork. He showed us the deed. We signed contracts with him. We poured our entire life savings into this property." Susan stepped up beside him, her eyes wide with frantic desperation. She pointed her manicured finger at the imported stone beneath her feet. "We put $300,000 into this renovation," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the estate. "We gutted the east wing. We built that custom pool. We bought the imported Italian marble for the grand foyer. We own half of this estate, Clifford. You are just a confused old man, and you are ruining my daughter's launch party. Security needs to throw you out right now." I looked down at them from the stage. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I let a cold, calculating smile spread across my face. I looked at Richard and Susan, not as human beings, but as two structurally deficient pillars that were about to crumble under the weight of their own massive ignorance. I reached into the interior pocket of my bespoke charcoal gray suit and pulled out the heavy blue legal folder. The crowd of investors and politicians leaned in closer, completely captivated by the unfolding financial disaster. "You own absolutely nothing, Susan," I said, my voice booming through the outdoor speakers, crystal clear and completely devoid of mercy. "You and your husband were conned by your own son-in-law. Julian showed you a forged quitclaim deed. He convinced you to liquidate your entire retirement fund to pay for renovations on a property he did not legally own. He needed your money to maintain his illusion of wealth, and you were greedy enough to hand it over without hiring a single competent real estate attorney to verify the title." Richard turned pale. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly shade of gray. "That is a lie," Richard shouted, but his voice lacked any real conviction. He looked at Julian, who was still kneeling on the ground, refusing to make eye contact. "Julian, tell them it is a lie," Richard pleaded. Tell them we own half the house. Tell them our contracts are valid." Julian did not answer. He just let out a pathetic, muffled sob. The realization hit Richard like a freight train, but he was too stubborn to accept his total financial ruin. "I am calling our lawyers," Richard yelled, turning back to me. "You cannot just steal our money. We have signed investment contracts. We have bank wire receipts proving we paid the contractors directly. We put $300,000 into your house, Clifford. If Julian does not own it, then you owe us that money. We will put a lien on your property tomorrow morning. We will sue you for every penny you have." I let out a slow, dark chuckle that reverberated through the microphone. The wealthy real estate developers in the crowd began to whisper among themselves, shaking their heads. They already knew exactly what I was about to say. They knew the law, and they knew Richard was completely doomed. "You cannot put a lien on this property, Richard," I explained, speaking to him as if I were educating a very slow child. "And you certainly cannot sue me for the money you foolishly handed over to a fraudulent contractor. You see, 15 years ago, my late wife Vivian and I placed this entire estate into an impenetrable blind corporate trust registered in the state of Delaware." I opened the blue folder, holding up the certified trust documents for the entire crowd to witness. The official gold seals gleamed under the stage lights. "This house does not belong to Clifford Henderson," I continued. "This house belongs entirely to Vanguard Holdings. I am simply the controlling beneficiary of the trust." Julian forged a document attempting to transfer a property from a man who has not legally owned it for over a decade. Your contracts with Julian are completely worthless pieces of paper. They are legally void. You signed an agreement with a man who had absolutely no ownership stake, no legal authority, and no right to authorize a single hammer swing on this land. Susan let out a horrifying, high-pitched gasp, dropping her tiny lapdog onto the slate tiles. The dog scurried away into the bushes. She grabbed Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive pastel polo shirt. "Richard, what is he saying?" Susan cried, her voice trembling with absolute terror. "What does he mean the contracts are void? Where is our retirement money, Richard? Where is our $300,000? Richard was shaking uncontrollably. He looked at the custom swimming pool he had paid for. He looked at the expensive slate tiles beneath his feet. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with a profound, devastating panic. "But we paid for the renovations," Richard stammered, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "We paid for the marble. We paid for the pool. You cannot just keep it. That is our money. That is our entire life savings. You have to pay us back." I stepped closer to the edge of the wooden platform, looking directly down into his terrified eyes. I lowered the microphone slightly, allowing my natural voice to carry the full weight of his destruction. "I do not owe you a single dime, Richard," I said, my tone absolutely freezing. "Let me educate you on how the law actually works in this state. Under Georgia real estate law, any unauthorized renovations or improvements performed on a property you do not legally own are legally classified as a permanent unconditional gift to the rightful property owner." The silence in the backyard was absolute. The wealthy investors stared at Richard with a mixture of pity and severe secondhand embarrassment. They knew I was completely correct. "You did not secure a summer home, Richard." I continued, driving the final nail into his financial coffin. "You did not secure your generational wealth. You and your greedy wife willingly and legally donated your entire $300,000 retirement fund to Vanguard Holdings. You upgraded my plumbing. You modernized my electrical grid. You increased the market value of my corporate asset by at least $500,000. And you did it all completely free of charge." Richard staggered backward as if he had been physically struck in the chest. He grabbed his own hair, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. He had spent his entire life looking down on people like me. He thought because I was an older African-American man who lived quietly and wore sensible clothes that I was an ignorant fool he could easily exploit. He thought he was stepping on my grave to elevate his own social status. Now he realized he had just financed the ultimate luxury upgrade for a man who possessed 10 times his wealth and 100 times his intellect. I looked at the imported Italian marble visible through the massive glass patio doors. I looked at the beautiful, cascading waterfall pouring into the custom pool. I turned my gaze back to Richard and Susan, who were standing frozen in the absolute wreckage of their financial future. "Thank you for the Italian marble, Richard," I said, my voice completely devoid of mercy. "And thank you for the beautiful swimming pool. I am sure it will look absolutely fantastic when I list this property on the market next week." The words hit Susan like a physical blow. Her eyes rolled back into her head, her knees completely buckled beneath her. She collapsed backward, plummeting toward the expensive slate tiles she had just paid to install. Richard tried to catch her, but he was too weak and paralyzed by his own shock. Susan hit the ground hard, her designer purse spilling its contents across the patio. The crowd of wealthy elites gasped, stepping even further away from the disgraced family. Nobody rushed forward to help them. Nobody offered them a hand. They were completely isolated in their absolute financial and social ruin. Richard fell to his knees beside his unconscious wife, shaking her shoulders, crying openly in front of 150 people. He was completely broken. His retirement was gone. His daughter was married to a federal criminal. His reputation in Atlanta high society was permanently annihilated. He had nothing left but the clothes on his back and the horrific realization that he had destroyed his own life through pure, unadulterated greed. I stood on the stage watching the tragic, pathetic scene unfold. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy. They had thrown Vivian's vintage sewing machine and our family photo albums into a rusted industrial dumpster. They had called her memories ghetto clutter. They had packed my clothes into a black trash bag and told me to rot in a state-run facility because I ruined their aesthetic. Now their aesthetic was the only thing left of them. It was a beautiful, incredibly expensive aesthetic that now belonged entirely to me. I took a deep breath of the humid evening air, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over my chest. The structural integrity of their arrogant tower was completely compromised. The foundation had crumbled into dust. The total demolition was finally complete. Susan lay completely unconscious on the expensive slate tiles while Richard wept beside her like a broken child. The high society guests formed a wide circle around them, treating the disgraced couple like a highly contagious disease. I did not offer them a single ounce of sympathy. My eyes shifted away from the shattered in-laws and locked onto the real target of the evening. Julian was still kneeling on the ground, his custom-tailored suit wrinkled and stained with the scotch he had dropped. He was trembling uncontrollably, but the absolute worst part of his nightmare had just begun. I turned my body slightly facing the massive crowd of wealthy venture capitalists and powerful angel investors who had gathered in my backyard. These were the people Julian had spent months desperately courting. They were the financial lifelines he needed to save his failing technology startup. They stood holding their crystal champagne flutes, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. They knew I held the power to destroy everything they had invested in. I raised the microphone, bringing it close to my mouth, ensuring my voice carried across the silent, shimmering water of the newly built custom swimming pool perfectly. Listen to me very carefully, I instructed the elite crowd staring out at the sea of expensive designer suits and shimmering evening gowns. You are all standing here tonight celebrating the highly anticipated launch of a revolutionary technology company. My son convinced you that he was a brilliant innovator capable of changing the digital landscape. He told you that his corporate vision would yield massive financial returns for anyone smart enough to fund his operation. He completely manipulated you, using my stolen estate to project an utterly false image of extreme stability and profound generational wealth to secure your investments. The reality is much darker. I continued, my tone devoid of any emotion whatsoever. His technology startup is completely bankrupt. He exhausted all of his initial funding months ago, trying to maintain a lifestyle he could not afford. The expensive cars he drives, the luxurious vacations he takes, and the massive wedding he threw last year were entirely subsidized by me. I paid his debts, I covered his corporate failures. But when my generosity finally stopped, he decided to steal my home and use it as collateral to commit a massive federal crime right in front of your eyes today. I reached into the interior pocket of my bespoke charcoal gray suit jacket. I bypassed the lethal legal documents and pulled out the small, cheap prepaid burner phone I had hidden inside my heavy work boots during my time at the nursing home. I held the black device up high under the bright security lights. The crowd watched me in total silence, mesmerized by the unfolding destruction. This is not just a phone, I told them. This is the exact tool I used to systematically record every single treasonous conversation my son and his greedy wife had inside my home. Julian let out a loud, horrific gasp, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. "Dad, please do not do this," Julian begged, his voice echoing across the silent patio. "I will give the money back. I will cancel the company. Just please put the phone away." I ignored his pathetic pleading completely. I turned the volume on the small device up to its maximum setting and held the tiny speaker directly against the microphone. I pressed the play button, allowing the high-definition audio recording to broadcast clearly and loudly across the entire backyard for every single investor to hear. The recording started with a burst of static, followed immediately by Julian speaking in his home office. The sound of his own arrogant voice filled the humid Atlanta air. The audio was crisp, undeniable, and incredibly damning. "I forged your signature, old man," Julian boasted on the recording, his recorded tone dripping with pure malice. "I faked the deed, and the county clerk swallowed it whole. And what are you going to do about it? Who is going to believe a dementia patient rotting in a state-run facility over a successful tech chief executive officer? You own absolutely nothing." The wealthy investors gasped in unified horror, listening to the undeniable proof of blatant forgery. But the recording did not stop there. It skipped forward to the conversation Julian had with the federal bank loan officer in New York. "I need this $500,000 transferred into our corporate accounts immediately to cover payroll," Julian pleaded on the tape. "The house is fully mine. There are no other claims on the deed. Send the money as soon as the compliance check clears." The audio captured his breathless desperation, laying bare the exact anatomy of his massive federal wire fraud. I pressed the stop button on the burner phone and lowered the microphone back to my chest. The silence that followed the recording was heavier than wet cement. Every single person in the backyard understood exactly what they had just heard. Julian had not just lied to his family. He had orchestrated a fraudulent $500,000 loan using a forged deed across state lines. "My son deliberately infected his entire corporate startup with highly illegal funds," I explained to the crowd of frozen investors. "Every single dollar flowing through his business right now is toxic, stolen federal money. If you are currently invested in his company, I continued driving the final nail into his corporate coffin. You are now directly tied to a massive interstate banking fraud investigation." The Federal Bureau of Investigation is already tracking the $500,000 that landed in his account yesterday morning. The very champagne you are holding in your hands was purchased with proceeds from a federal crime. Anyone associated with this startup will undoubtedly face intense legal scrutiny, interrogations, and potential asset freezing by federal authorities before the sun comes up tomorrow. You have backed a doomed and rotting horse. Panic erupted instantly. The calm, composed demeanor of the high society crowd vanished in a fraction of a second. These were people who survived by protecting their wealth at all costs. The mere mention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and frozen assets sent them into absolute chaos. Crystal champagne flutes shattered against the slate patio as people dropped their drinks and scrambled toward the exits. Men in expensive suits pulled out their smartphones, frantically dialing their corporate attorneys, demanding immediate legal separation from Julian Henderson. Women in designer gowns pushed past each other, rushing down the long circular driveway. Julian tried to stand up, his legs shaking violently beneath him. He reached his hands out toward the fleeing investors, desperate to stop the mass exodus. "Wait. Please listen to me," Julian screamed, his voice cracking in terror. "It is not what it seems. I can explain the funding. I can fix the capitalization table. Do not leave." But nobody listened to him. The powerful venture capitalists shoved him aside, treating him like empty garbage. They bumped into his shoulders, ignoring his pathetic tears. His entire professional network abandoned him in a matter of seconds, running to save their own fortunes. Chloe stood frozen near the edge of the custom swimming pool, watching her lavish launch party disintegrate into absolute pandemonium. She looked at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The wealthy friends she had invited to show off her new stolen aesthetic were running away from her home like it was burning to the ground. She realized that she was legally tied to a man who had just publicly confessed to a federal felony. Her high society dreams were completely vaporized, replaced instantly by the terrifying reality of impending criminal charges, massive legal debt, and absolute disgrace. I remained standing on the raised wooden platform, watching the glorious destruction of their arrogant empire. I did not move a single muscle as the chaotic stampede cleared out the backyard. I watched Julian fall back onto his knees, sobbing uncontrollably into his hands. His tech startup was dead. His reputation was completely annihilated. The money he stole from the federal bank was going to send him to a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades. He had tried to throw his father away like broken trash, but he had only succeeded in completely and utterly destroying his own life. The loud, frantic noise of the fleeing guests began to fade, leaving only the sound of Julian crying and the splashing waterfall of the newly installed pool. The air felt lighter, easier to breathe. The massive weight of their deceit had been entirely lifted from my shoulders. I looked down at my son, feeling the cold, satisfying peace of a structural engineer watching a corrupt building fall exactly as calculated. I had perfectly executed the demolition. The toxic foundation was gone forever. There was nothing left for them but the cold, hard steel bars of a federal prison cell waiting. My own son handed me a single black trash bag containing my clothes and told me I no longer fit the aesthetic of my own home. His wife stood on the porch of the multi-million-dollar Atlanta estate I paid for, complaining about the ghetto clutter she had just tossed into an industrial dumpster. That clutter was my late wife Vivian's entire legacy. They pointed me to a rundown state facility and told me to disappear. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply turned around and walked away. But what those two fools did not realize was that a retired structural engineer knows exactly which load-bearing walls to knock out to make a house collapse. Before I tell you how I tore their perfect lives down to the foundation, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your parents should always come with a devastating price. My name is Clifford Henderson, and I am 74 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer building commercial high-rises across the country while quietly investing every spare dollar into real estate. Vivian and I built a quiet, beautiful life together. We did not flaunt our wealth. We wore simple clothes, drove reliable cars, and poured our love into our only son, Julian. When Vivian passed away suddenly last year, my world went completely dark. The quiet of our massive, historic brick estate in Buckhead, Atlanta became suffocating. So when Julian asked to move in temporarily with his new wife, Chloe, I made the biggest mistake a grieving father could make. I said yes. I thought having family close would heal the void in my chest. I thought Julian, who was struggling to get his tech startup off the ground, needed his father. I was wrong. They did not want a father. They wanted a free luxury hotel and an ATM. The true nightmare began on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. I was returning home from a routine checkup with my cardiologist. The car pulled up to my long circular driveway, and my heart instantly dropped into my stomach. Sitting right on the curb, crushing the manicured grass Vivian used to meticulously care for, was a massive, rusted industrial dumpster. I stepped out of the car, my knees feeling heavy. I walked toward the steel bin and looked over the edge. What I saw inside made my breath catch in my throat. It was not old furniture or construction debris. It was Vivian. There, buried under discarded cardboard boxes and empty iced coffee cups, was her vintage Singer sewing machine, the one she used to mend Julian's torn jeans when he was a little boy. Next to it were her favorite floral dresses, the ones that still faintly smelled of her signature lavender perfume. And scattered across the top like meaningless trash were our family photo albums. Decades of memories, vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, just tossed away like garbage. I reached in with trembling hands and pulled out one of the heavy leather-bound albums, brushing the dirt off the cover. My chest tightened with an agonizing grief that quickly morphed into something entirely different. A cold, hard rage began to freeze the blood in my veins. I turned toward the house. Standing on the expansive wraparound porch were Julian and Chloe. Chloe was wearing expensive designer athletic wear, holding a green matcha latte, looking at her phone. Julian stood beside her wearing a crisp, tailored suit, looking every bit the successful tech CEO he pretended to be. I walked up the stone steps, my face a blank mask. What is the meaning of this? Julian, I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Chloe rolled her eyes and took a sip of her drink before Julian could even speak. Oh my God. Clifford, please do not make a scene. She sighed in that condescending, high-pitched tone she always used with me. We are remodeling the entire ground floor. This house is a historic gem, but the interior was completely ruining our vibe. We had to purge all that old ghetto clutter. It was frankly embarrassing to have our investors over with all those dusty doilies and ancient junk everywhere. Ghetto clutter. She was referring to African artifacts Vivian and I had imported from Ghana. She was referring to hand-carved mahogany tables and family heirlooms that told the story of our ancestry. I looked at my son, expecting him to defend his mother's memory. Instead, Julian just adjusted his expensive watch and looked me dead in the eye with a chilling corporate coldness. Chloe is right, Dad, Julian said without a trace of emotion. We are hosting a massive launch party for my startup next month. We need the space to reflect success and innovation. You living here shuffling around looking sad all the time, it just does not fit the aesthetic we are going for anymore. You are holding us back, holding them back. I paid the property taxes, I paid the utility bills. I had even paid off Julian's massive credit card debts twice in the last 5 years. Julian reached behind the porch pillar and pulled out a single black plastic trash bag. He dropped it at my feet. It landed with a pathetic thud. "I packed your essentials," he said, handing me a folded piece of paper. "This is the address to the Pine Haven Care Facility. It is a state-run home, but it is perfectly adequate for your needs. I already paid for the first month. The car I called for you should be here any minute. You need to be around people your own age, Dad. You need medical supervision." Medical supervision. My mind raced. I was 74, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. My doctor had just told me I had the heart of a 50-year-old man. They were not sending me away for my health. They were discarding me because I was an inconvenience to their high society masquerade. A normal man would have screamed. A normal father would have slapped his son across the face, demanded respect, and ordered them off his property. But I am not a normal man. I spent my entire career calculating stress points, figuring out exactly how much weight a structure can take before it collapses. I looked at Julian and Chloe standing there on my porch, dripping with unearned arrogance, and I realized something vital. If I fought them now, they would just call the police, claim I was having a senile episode, and make my life miserable. If I kicked them out today, they would just move to another apartment and continue their pathetic facade of a life. That was not enough. They had thrown my wife's soul into a dumpster. They needed to lose everything. I looked at Julian's smug face and then at Chloe, who was already scrolling through her phone again, completely unbothered by the fact that she was tearing a family apart. I did not say a single word. I did not shed a single tear. I bent down slowly, ignoring the ache in my knees, and picked up the black trash bag containing a few of my shirts and pants. I clutched Vivian's photo album tightly under my left arm. I turned my back on my own son and walked down the long driveway toward the waiting car. I could feel their eyes on my back, likely celebrating their easy victory. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was too weak, too broken by grief to fight back. As I got into the back seat of the car, I looked out the window at the beautiful brick estate I had purchased decades ago. I watched Julian put his arm around Chloe, laughing about something as they walked back inside my house. The mass exodus of wealthy investors and high society elite left my backyard completely abandoned in a matter of minutes. The only sounds remaining were the gentle splashing of the cascading waterfall pouring into the custom swimming pool and the pathetic muffled sobs of my son kneeling on the expensive slate tiles. Julian was completely broken, a man who had flown too close to the sun on wings, made of forged documents and stolen money. Chloe stood a few feet away, staring at the empty patio, her silver designer gown looking entirely ridiculous in the aftermath of their absolute social and financial annihilation. She was processing the fact that her luxurious life was nothing but a mirage that had just evaporated into thin air. I remained standing on the raised wooden platform, breathing in the warm, humid Atlanta evening air. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settling over my chest. I had spent my entire life calculating load-bearing capacities, ensuring buildings would never collapse under pressure. Tonight, I had deliberately designed a catastrophic structural failure, and I watched it execute flawlessly. Then the piercing wail of heavy sirens shattered the quiet night. The sound started as a distant echo rolling over the hills of the affluent Buckhead neighborhood before rapidly multiplying in volume and intensity. It was a chorus of impending justice. Through the massive newly installed bay windows, I saw the blinding strobe of red and blue emergency lights illuminating the grand foyer. The harsh, flashing colors reflected off the imported Italian marble, casting eerie dancing shadows across the sterile modern artwork Chloe had hung on my walls. The sweeping circular driveway was instantly flooded with highly marked local police cruisers and several unmarked black sport utility vehicles belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Car doors slammed aggressively. Heavy boots stomped onto the concrete. The final wrecking crew had officially arrived to haul away the debris of my son's arrogance. A team of heavily armed federal agents, wearing dark tactical vests, stormed through the open double front doors. They were accompanied by local Atlanta police officers, whose radios crackled with harsh static. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, spreading out across the empty living spaces, securing all the exits. Agent Miller, the sharp federal investigator I had met in the downtown skyscraper, led the tactical team directly out onto the back patio. His eyes swept across the scene, immediately locking onto Julian, who was still shivering on the ground. This was not a friendly visit to sort out a family misunderstanding. This was a fully coordinated federal raid executed to apprehend a man who had defrauded a major financial institution across state lines. Agent Miller marched across the slate tiles, stopping directly in front of my son, Julian Henderson. The agent announced, his voice booming with absolute unyielding authority. "You are under arrest for interstate wire fraud, federal bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit forgery. Stand up and place your hands behind your back immediately." Julian let out a horrific, suffocating gasp. He looked up at the federal agents, his face slick with sweat and tears. He tried to scramble backward, but his legs were completely useless. He looked toward me, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate terror. "Dad, please," Julian screamed, his voice cracking in the humid air. "Dad, tell them to stop. I will give the money back. I will sign the house back over to you. I will do whatever you want. Please do not let them take me to prison. I cannot go to a federal prison." I stepped down from the wooden platform, walking slowly until I stood just a few feet away from the boy I had raised. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no mercy in my heart. "You cannot give the house back, Julian," I explained, my tone completely flat and cold. "You never owned the house, and you cannot give the stolen bank money back because you already spent $50,000 of it to pay for this ridiculous party. You built a house of cards on top of a sinkhole, and now you have to live in the wreckage. Take him away, Agent Miller." Two robust federal agents stepped forward, grabbing Julian's arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. They spun him around, violently snapping heavy metal handcuffs onto his wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed across the patio, sealing his fate. Julian wept openly, his body going limp as the agents began dragging him back into the house toward the flashing red and blue lights waiting in the driveway. The golden child, the arrogant tech chief executive officer, was reduced to a crying criminal facing 20 years behind bars. Chloe watched her husband being hauled away like common garbage. Her shock immediately morphed into a vicious, desperate instinct for self-preservation. She realized her luxury lifestyle was completely dead, and she was desperate to detach herself from the sinking ship. She lunged forward, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Julian's retreating back. "I had nothing to do with this," Chloe shrieked hysterically, turning to face Agent Miller and the local police officers. "I am totally innocent." Julian hid the financial documents from me. "I did not know the deed was forged. I did not know the bank loan was fraudulent. He lied to me just like he lied to everyone else. I am a victim of his manipulation." She put her hands on her face, attempting to force tears to stream down her cheeks, playing the role of the betrayed, naive wife. She thought she could simply discard Julian the same way she had discarded my late wife Vivian's sewing machine. She thought she could smile her way out of a federal conspiracy. I reached into the interior pocket of my bespoke charcoal gray suit and pulled out my burner phone for the second time that evening. I did not let her finish her pathetic theatrical performance. "Chloe," I said, my voice slicing through her fake sobbing like a razor blade. "You truly believe you can just lie your way out of federal custody. You think you are smarter than everyone else in this yard, but you forget that I spent 5 days rotting in that miserable nursing home while you and my son came to gloat." I pressed the play button on the audio application, holding the phone up for Agent Miller and the police officers to hear clearly. The high-definition recording captured perfectly inside the visitor lounge of the Pine Haven Care Facility began to play. "See," Julian Chloe's recorded voice sneered through the speaker, dripping with extreme malice and absolute arrogance. "I told you his brain is completely fried. He does not even remember she is dead." The recording captured her mocking laugh, echoing horribly. "Let us get out of here, Julian. It smells like death in here, and he is grossing me out." "Do not worry, babe," Julian replied on the tape. "We never have to come back here again. The old man is done." The recording stopped. Chloe froze completely, her fake tears instantly drying up. Her mouth hung open in absolute terror as she realized I had captured her precise, active participation in my calculated abuse. "You did not just know about the fraudulent deed, Chloe," I told her, taking a step closer until I could see the sheer panic vibrating in her eyes. "You actively helped my son strip me of my dignity. You drove me to a state-run facility to die so you could rip out my mahogany floors and host a party with stolen federal funds. You are not a victim. You are a highly active co-conspirator in a massive scheme to commit elder abuse and bank fraud. Agent Miller nodded to a local female police officer standing nearby. Chloe Henderson, the agent stated coldly, placing a hand on his utility belt. You are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and elder abuse. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Chloe completely lost her mind. She shrieked violently, thrashing her arms, fighting against the female officer who stepped forward to detain her. "Do not touch me!" Chloe screamed, her silver designer gown tearing at the seam as she resisted. "You cannot arrest me. I am a socialite. I have rights. You are ruining my life." The officer easily overpowered her, twisting Chloe's arms behind her back and securing the steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. Chloe continued to wail and kick as she was forcibly marched through the grand foyer, her expensive high heels slipping on the imported Italian marble she had stolen my money to buy. She was dragged out the front doors and shoved into the back of a police cruiser sitting right next to her disgraced, weeping husband. The patio was suddenly very quiet again. The federal agents began securing the property, taping off areas to process financial documents left in my home office. I turned my attention to the final two parasites remaining in my backyard. Richard and Susan Sterling were still huddled together on the slate tiles. Susan had regained consciousness, but she looked completely disoriented and thoroughly broken. Her bright pink designer dress was stained with dirt and spilled champagne. Richard was holding her hand, his face pale and completely devoid of his usual snobbish arrogance. They watched their daughter get dragged away in handcuffs, realizing they were completely, utterly alone in a house they did not own, without a single penny to their names. I reached into the final pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out the crisp legal documents Renee had prepared for me earlier that afternoon. I walked over to the disgraced couple standing directly over them. I did not offer them a hand to help them up. I looked down at them with absolute structural coldness. "Richard," I said, my voice carrying zero empathy, "I am holding official eviction notices signed by a state judge earlier today. Because you do not possess a valid lease agreement and because you engaged in highly unauthorized renovations on a corporate trust property, you are legally classified as hostile squatters." I dropped the heavy legal papers directly onto Richard's chest. "You have exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever clothes you brought into my house and vacate the premises. I ordered, my tone absolutely final. If you are still standing on this property when that 10 minutes expires, I will instruct these police officers to arrest both of you for criminal trespassing." Richard stared at the eviction papers, his hands shaking violently. "Clifford, please," Richard begged, his voice reducing to a pathetic whimper. "We have absolutely nothing left. We poured our entire retirement savings into this house. Where are we supposed to go? We cannot afford a hotel. We do not even have money for a cab. Please, you have to give us some of our money back. You cannot do this to us." I leaned down slightly, ensuring he could see the total absence of mercy in my eyes. "You threw my wife's memories into a garbage dumpster, Richard," I whispered coldly. "You called her beautiful African heritage ghetto clutter. You plan to turn my tragedy into your luxury summer vacation home. I am not doing anything to you. I am simply letting gravity take the structure you built. Your 10 minutes started exactly 30 seconds ago. I highly suggest you start walking." Susan began to sob loudly, clinging to Richard's arm as he struggled to stand up. They looked like two broken animals, terrified and completely destitute. They stumbled toward the patio doors, walking across the beautiful cascading pool deck they had paid for with their entire life savings. They walked through the bright white imported marble foyer, their heads bowed in absolute shame. They did not have time to pack bags. They did not have time to gather belongings. They walked out the front doors and down the long, circular driveway wearing nothing but the clothes on their backs. They wandered out into the dark, humid Atlanta night, completely ruined, their retirement entirely gone, their daughter locked in a police cruiser, and their arrogant high society dreams completely annihilated. I stood alone on the back patio, breathing in the quiet night air. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded away as the police cruisers drove down the street, taking the trash away from my home for good. The eviction was complete. the arrests were made. The structure was completely clear of all parasitic infestations. I had executed the perfect demolition. The flashing police lights finally disappeared down the long, dark street, leaving my historic Buckhead estate in complete silence. The massive backyard that had been filled with arrogant guests was now entirely empty. The catered food sat untouched. The champagne flutes remained shattered across the slate tiles. The string quartet had fled long ago. I stood completely alone on the edge of the custom swimming pool, breathing the cool, humid air of the Atlanta night. The structural demolition I had meticulously planned was finally over. The toxic parasites had been eradicated from my property, and the suffocating weight of their arrogance was lifted from my shoulders. I turned around and walked back into my house. Stepping through the glass patio doors, I walked across the pristine white, imported Italian marble that Richard and Susan Sterling had purchased with their entire life savings. The grand foyer felt different now. It no longer felt like a hostile corporate lobby designed to impress wealthy venture capitalists. It felt like a monument to my ultimate victory. I walked past the sterile, modern art Chloe had hung on the walls and headed directly toward my home office. The room was quiet. Julian's computer monitors were powered down, and his fraudulent financial documents had been confiscated by the Federal Bureau. I walked over to the antique oak desk I had reclaimed and sat in my leather chair. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small brass key. Earlier that afternoon, before I had visited the bespoke tailor and met with my ruthless attorney, Renee, I had made a very important stop at my private bank. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a heavy object wrapped in soft protective velvet. I carefully unwrapped the velvet, revealing the familiar worn leather cover of Vivian's favorite family photo album. Julian and Chloe believed they had thrown this precious album into the rusted industrial dumpster along with Vivian's vintage sewing machine. They thought they had successfully erased her beautiful memory from this estate, but they fundamentally underestimated the calculated foresight of a structural engineer. On that very first day, when Julian handed me the black trash bag and ordered me to leave, I had discreetly rescued this album from the rubble. I had tucked it tightly under my arm and placed it inside a secure safety deposit box. The moment I left the neighborhood, I ran my weathered hands over the leather cover, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace. Vivian was safe. Her legacy was protected, and the people who tried to discard her had been thrown into the garbage themselves. Over the next several months, the legal and financial aftermath of that night unfolded exactly as I had designed it. Julian and Chloe were completely destroyed by the federal justice system. Julian stood before a federal judge and pleaded guilty to interstate wire fraud, bank fraud, and elder abuse. The judge showed absolutely no mercy to a man who stole $500,000 and tried to commit his own father to a state-run facility. Julian was sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Chloe attempted to play the victim, but the audio recordings proved she was an active co-conspirator in the plot to drain my assets. She was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for her direct involvement in the financial crime. Their arrogant high society dreams were vaporized. Richard and Susan Sterling, the in-laws who had looked down on me and mocked my African heritage, faced a completely different kind of prison, because they had foolishly poured their entire $300,000 retirement fund into a property they did not legally own. They were left destitute. They were forced to move out of their comfortable suburban lifestyle and relocate to a cramped, roach-infested 2-bedroom apartment on the worst side of town. They are currently drowning in massive credit card debt, working minimum wage jobs in their late 60s just to afford basic groceries. They have nothing left but the bitter, humiliating memory of the night they were evicted, with only the clothes on their backs. As for my property, I decided I no longer wanted to live in a house tainted by their superficial renovations. I placed the historic Buckhead estate on the market because of the expensive imported Italian marble, the modernized plumbing, and the spectacular custom swimming pool. The property value skyrocketed. I sold the estate to a wealthy international buyer for double its original value, cashing a check for over $6 million. I did not keep that money for myself. I used the millions of dollars to establish a massive permanent endowment at a prestigious university in Atlanta. I opened a comprehensive engineering scholarship program, designed exclusively to fully fund the education of brilliant young African American students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. The foundation operates entirely in my late wife's name, honoring the beautiful legacy Julian and Chloe tried so desperately to destroy. Every year, dozens of bright young minds will achieve their wildest dreams because of the money those greedy fools unwittingly provided. Blood may make you related, but it is loyalty and respect that make you family. I spent my life building an empire to hand down to my son, only to realize that inherited wealth without inherited character breeds nothing but monsters. Greed is a blinding poison. It convinces fools that kindness is a weakness to be exploited, but an old tree has deep roots. When you try to cut down the people who nurtured you, do not be surprised when the branches fall and crush you. Protect your peace, guard your legacy, and never let anyone steal your dignity. If you enjoyed this story, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute justice. Thank you for watching, and always remember to stand your ground.